This guy had tried absolutely everything, and everyone around him laughing their heads off because he had the nerve to pick the gunslinger class. Yeah, they thought he was the biggest joke of them all. What they didn't know was that the gunslinger was actually a legendary class in disguise, but that was after awakening. Before any of that, his past life was, to put it kindly, complete and total trash. His sister was taken from him right before his eyes, and Liu Yi couldn't do a single thing to stop it. The bullies glared him down, threw his sister to the ground, and all he could do was cry. He couldn't even stand up. Then a sword pierced through his back, and as he lay there with his sister, the men just laughed, kicking them both and calling them weaklings. Liu Yi kept breathing, barely, regretting every second of his life because his one greatest dream had always been to protect his sister. He never could have imagined that the game UN World would one day become reality, and that every single player would gain the powers they had built up inside it, but since he'd barely played, he was stuck with a weak, underdeveloped character. Classic. Even so, the man had Chad energy running through his veins. Fueled by pure rage, he refused to let those bastards laugh over his sister's death. Liu Yi forced himself to his feet and screamed, and drove that sword straight into the bastard's skull. Only then did he finally collapse to the ground. At peace, ready to die, but then something happened. He woke up in his bed, 3 years before the game took over the world. Liu Yi jolted upright, heart hammering, completely unable to process what was happening. He clearly remembered being killed. He looked around, disoriented, until it hit him. This was his old apartment, the one he'd lived in 3 years ago. Then the door swung open and a familiar female voice floated into the room. Liu Yi shot to his feet, unable to believe his eyes. Standing in the hallway was his sister, holding a box containing the access key for UN World. With a voice barely holding together, he asked her what year it was. His sister Yun gave him a puzzled look, joked that he must have woken up on the wrong side of the bed, and told him it was 2030. That hit like a truck. Liu Yi went completely still, unable to process what he was hearing. Then he snapped into motion, bolted to the window, and stood there, mouth hanging open as the realization crashed over him. He had returned to the exact day UN World first went live. He didn't waste a single second. He pulled his sister into a tight hug and made a silent vow. This time he wouldn't let her die. He would become the strongest player, as long as this wasn't all just a dream. July 27, 2030, the virtual reality game UN World launched to the world. Then on September 1st, it did the unthinkable. It crossed over into reality. Every player received the abilities their in-game character had built up. The marginalized, the overlooked, the forgotten lower classes, suddenly they had power. Real, overwhelming power they never dreamed they could possess. And with that kind of shift in power, chaos followed. Endless wars over money, territory, and dominance erupted across the world. Our protagonist had spent his first life as a casual player who just wandered around exploring, and that carefree choice led him straight to a tragic end. His low level got him killed in UN World. But through some twist of fate, he was given a miracle, a second chance, reborn 3 years in the past, right before the game's launch. And this time, he was done playing around. This time, he was going to become the strongest. Coming back to his senses, he realized he'd been squeezing his sister in a bear hug without even noticing. She shoved him off, face burning red, convinced her brother had completely lost it. He scratched the back of his head, let out an awkward laugh, and admitted that yeah, he could see how that looked. Fast forward 8 hours to the launch of UN World. Our protagonist strapped on his virtual reality headset, lay back on his bed and ran the numbers. Only 34 days before the game consumed the real world. If he could reach the top in that window of time, he and his sister would survive. The moment he entered the game, he spawned in the starting plaza, already buzzing with players. At the center of the crowd, an administrator was about to demonstrate the power of the strength ability. The first strike was clean but unimpressive, splitting a large rock only halfway through. Then the administrator focused his energy and delivered a second strike. One clean motion and the rock split in two like it was made of tofu. Liu Yi watched the whole thing with his jaw on the floor, literally standing there, mouth wide open. When the training demonstration wrapped up, the system wasted no time and transported our protagonist directly into the game world. At the spawn point, players were scattered everywhere, eyes wide, completely dazzled by this new world around them. But Liu Yi had exactly one thing on his mind: level up and do it fast. He locked in on the strength ability first, since it was considered the most mysterious stat in the game and the true dividing line between an average player and a genuine warrior. No detours, no sightseeing, he made a beeline for the training pavilion. One thing worth knowing about UN World: there were no fixed combat classes. Everything was built around the weapon you chose to master. Liu Yi understood this perfectly. Reach 100% proficiency with a weapon and the strength ability would fully awaken. Weapon mastery was everything. That urgency pushed him into a jog as he headed for the weapons pavilion, half expecting to find it packed wall to wall with other players. But when he stepped inside, the place was completely empty, not a soul in sight. Liu Yi didn't care even a little. He had a goal and nothing was going to get in the way of it. He walked straight up to the weapon rack and got to work. The katana was his first pick, always had been his favorite, but he knew he had to work through every option the rack had to offer. 5 brutal hours of non-stop training later, he was running on fumes. But he had done it, the katana was fully mastered, locked in as his primary weapon. He was exhausted, every muscle screamed at him to stop. He didn't. Without a second's hesitation, he grabbed a longsword and started all over again, pushing past the pain, ignoring his body's protests, grinding until there was nothing left. Back in the weapons pavilion, a couple strolled through the corridors, marveling at how insanely realistic everything looked and felt. Then the girl caught a glimpse of the training pavilion behind her friend. Strange sounds were echoing from inside. Curious, she asked what was going on in there. The guy glanced up at the sign above the entrance and shrugged. Probably just a training area, he said. The girl didn't wait for a better answer. She peeked around the edge of the doorway, and there was our protagonist, completely alone, hammering relentless strikes against a wooden dummy, completely locked in. The fact that he was the only one in there struck her as genuinely strange. The couple wandered over to the weapon rack, though neither of them picked anything up. They wanted to understand how the whole training system worked before committing. After watching for a few minutes, they tossed the weapons back on the ground and wrote it off. Boring activity, they said. Stuff only losers wasted their time on. As they turned to leave, the guy explained that the training pavilion only boosted weapon proficiency and offered 0 other advantages. He even pointed out that hitting 100% proficiency required at least 10,000 strikes. 10,000, the girl had heard enough. She said they should get out immediately and spend that time actually leveling up. Her friend agreed without hesitation. But before she left, she glanced back at Liu Yi one more time. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, he stuck in her memory. Liu Yi, for his part, didn't even register that anyone had been there. He just kept swinging, relentless, methodical, 0 intention of resting. By the end of day 1, he had fully mastered both the katana and the halberd. And yet, the special ability he'd been waiting for never appeared. Day 2, the spear, axe, shield, and hammer all maxed out. Still nothing, no power, no awakening. Day 3 rolled around. By now, other players had already climbed to levels 10 through 20. Liu Yi was still sitting at level 1 and his strength ability remained completely dormant. For a brief moment, he entertained the thought of maybe switching gears and leveling up first. He dismissed it almost immediately. If becoming the strongest was the goal, he needed his ability no matter what it cost him. Nothing was going to stop him. Meanwhile, out on the street near the training pavilion, that same couple was passing by again, chatting about a player who had just died and lost everything. The death penalty in UN world was brutal. 1 death and every experience level you'd earned was gone. Mid-conversation, the girl spotted Liu Yi again through the window, and her eyes went wide. He was still in there, still training. Her friend was equally stunned. He said there were 100 more exciting ways to play this game. Anything was better than grinding weapon training for days straight. The girl couldn't wrap her head around it. What was Liu Yi's deal? Her friend half-jokingly suggested maybe the guy knew some kind of hidden secret. Excited by the thought, he started considering trying weapon mastery himself. The girl shut that idea down fast. She pointed out that Liu Yi had been at it for 3 full days and had nothing to show for it, while other players were already hitting level 20. There was no way that approach could lead to winning. Liu Yi naturally didn't hear a word of it. He had a goal and 0 bandwidth for distractions. The girl grew more irritated watching him, calling him a gaming addict. She declared that even if he somehow became the strongest fighter, she would never touch weapon training. Leveling up is the only way. Done with the conversation, she grabbed her friend's arm and dragged him away. They had experience to earn. Days later, something unexpected popped up, a system notification. Liu Yi had mastered 18 different weapon types, and as a result, he had earned the title of Weapon Master. With this title came the ability to apply the properties and abilities of any of the other 17 weapons to whichever main weapon he was currently using. He stood there holding a whip, completely drained, just staring at the notification floating before him. He still couldn't understand what had gone wrong. Every melee weapon mastered, and yet the special ability he had been grinding toward never showed up. So he made a decision, ditch the bladed weapons entirely. Maybe his talent wasn't there, maybe it was with firearms. He wasted no time heading to the firearms pavilion. As he walked, something nagged at him. In his previous life, he had never once come across a player who used strength with firearms. Not one. When he stepped inside, an impressive hall opened up before him. Metal racks lined the walls, packed with an enormous variety of weapons. Liu Yi picked up a pistol without hesitating. Days were slipping by fast, over 5 of them already gone, and he was certain other players had long since hit level 30. And here he was, still at level 1. Looking out at the massive selection of firearms still waiting to be mastered, Liu Yi felt a knot form in his chest. There were too many. At this rate, UN World might take over reality before he could get through them all. For a moment, he genuinely questioned whether any of this was worth continuing. Then the memory hit him, his sister's death. That level 20 player who had killed her without a second thought. His blood ran hot, he had no choice. There was no going back. Without power, he'd never reach the top. He took a slow breath, raised the pistol and began. Even if his fate was to die again, he would not give up. Back at the training pavilion, the girl who had previously written Liu Yi off decided to come back and see if he was still at it. She peeked inside, empty. A surprised look crossed her face. She figured he had finally given up and moved on. Then a thunderous bang exploded from somewhere nearby, loud enough to make her freeze on the spot. What was that? Her instincts took over and she followed the sound up the stairs toward the firearms pavilion. She peered around the doorframe and stopped breathing. Liu Yi had just stopped firing. In front of him, the training target had been completely obliterated. And surrounding him, flickering like something alive, was a strange greenish aura, as if his very existence was shifting into something else. She slapped both hands over her mouth to stifle the sound threatening to escape. Her eyes were wide with something between awe and pure horror. What on earth was happening to him? Liu Yi himself hadn't moved an inch. He wasn't looking at anything around him, just standing there, eyes vacant, lost somewhere else entirely. But in reality, he was reading the notification he had been waiting days for. The message read, "Congratulations, you have reached 100% mastery with the pistol. As a reward, you have acquired a new ability." A shiver rolled down Liu Yi's spine. He had finally gotten his power. For the first time since he woke up in the past, he actually felt ready for what was coming. Quiet, disbelieving laugh slipped from his lips. Next step was clear: start leveling up and catch the other players. His base stats were straightforward: Strength 5, Agility 5, Endurance 5, Intelligence 5, Senses 5. The one outlier was Special Resistance, sitting at a lonely 1 point. A new passive skills icon had also appeared in his interface, though it was still empty. Heading for the exit, Liu Yi was locked in and ready to finally start his climb. But as he reached the door, he noticed a girl standing in the hallway. She immediately looked away, whistling casually, doing her absolute best to pretend she hadn't seen a single thing. Very convincing. Not convincing at all. Liu Yi didn't spare a thought trying to figure out what she had or hadn't witnessed. He walked straight past her like she was part of the furniture. For her part, the girl felt a strange flush of embarrassment wash over her. An irritating wave of heat crept up her face and she couldn't explain why. She wanted to ask what had happened in there, wanted to understand the aura she had seen flickering around him. But she hesitated, and in the end, she said nothing. Stepping out of the training pavilion, Liu Yi had a realization click into place. Only the weapon that truly suited a player could unlock their power. With that in mind, he made his next stop the equipment shop. He needed a pistol, ammo, and something for close quarters combat. On the way, he caught pieces of conversation drifting through the streets. Rumors about UN World, the one that landed hardest. The game had just crossed 10 million active players online. That number confirmed his worst fear. Time was moving way too fast. He arrived at the shop and got straight to business. He picked up a low-level pistol called the White Dragon for 500 coins, a box of 300 standard bullets for 300 coins, and a low-level dagger for 200 coins. A clean 1,000 coins total. Walking out, he felt a dull sting of frustration. The prices were steep, and the fact that in-game currency held real-world equivalent value made everything hit harder on the wallet. The company behind UN World had clearly not been shy about their pricing. Still, he had his weapons and that was what mattered. Then, staring at the dagger, an idea struck him. He activated his special skill, Weapon Master. The skill that let him bypass the natural limitations of any weapon, transferring the properties and power of one to another. His first real test was coming. Determined to put his new abilities to the test, Liu Yi made his way to the Mirror Kingdom gaming facility. The concept was simple. Players could generate a mirrored copy of themselves and fight it. Beat your copy and you walked away with bonus money and experience. 2 conditions applied to enter. First, the player had to be at least 5 levels below their copy. Second, they had to pay 10% of their gold as an entry fee. For Liu Yi, those conditions were practically a gift. He was still level 1, but now he had real power behind him. As he walked through the Mirror Kingdom's hall, frustrated scream tore through the air. 2 players had just respawned, fuming about how impossibly hard their mirror copies were to beat. It looked like they had lost everything they'd earned. Nearby, 2 other players watched the scene unfold with barely concealed amusement. They mocked the losers, then their eyes landed on Liu Yi. One of them clocked the pistol holstered at his waist and laughed outright. Worst possible weapon choice in the game, apparently. The other agreed completely, writing Liu Yi off as a clueless newbie who had no idea what he was doing. Liu Yi said nothing, he just looked at them. He had absolutely no idea what he was carrying now. Liu Yi confirmed his decision and mentally prepared himself for his first fight in the Mirror Kingdom. He knew the odds were stacked against him, no experience in real combat, no battle instincts yet, but he also knew he had no choice. He pulled up the system menu to get familiar with the interface. After browsing for a moment, a prompt appeared asking for confirmation to face a mirror player. His nerves were very much present, but Liu Yi hit confirm anyway, fully aware of what he was agreeing to. A second prompt followed asking him to confirm the 100 coin participation fee. He accepted. Then a third notification appeared, a reminder that once inside the Mirror Kingdom, players could not leave until the battle was finished. Moments later, Liu Yi felt the world shift around him as he was transported to the arena. His opponent stood across from him, already in position. The countdown began, 10 seconds to the start of the fight. When the counter hit 5 seconds, Liu Yi's nerves started getting the better of him. He had never voluntarily fought another person in his life, and the fear of what was about to happen was suffocating. His leg started trembling on its own, making his focus even harder to hold. He tapped at his leg trying to settle it down, but the distraction cost him, and he completely missed the moment the battle went live. His opponent came in immediately, red sword raised, charging straight at him. Liu Yi was sure it was already over before it even started, but somehow he managed to dodge the first swing and tried to return fire with his pistol. Every bullet missed, then he lost his footing and nearly face-planted. His opponent pressed the advantage instantly and with Liu Yi off balance disarmed him without even breaking a sweat. No weapon, no pistol. Liu Yi was now staring down a red sword with nothing but his bare hands. His opponent looked like he was already writing up the victory speech, but in that moment of complete desperation, something clicked. This was his second chance at life and he was not throwing it away here. He activated his weapon master skill, pushing the blade's properties to their limit. With the blade's strength amplified, Liu Yi actually managed to stop the incoming sword strike cold. The enhanced power surged through him, and he hit back with a force he hadn't known he had. Clean, precise, he sliced straight through his opponent's sword, rendered it completely useless, then finished the fight. Despite the win, Liu Yi was still shaking, hands trembling, breathing ragged, a physical reaction he had zero control over. And that frustrated him more than anything. He had just won and his body still hadn't gotten the memo. A few minutes earlier, 2 other players had been passing through the arena, talking strategy, griping about how rough Mirror Kingdom battles were, especially with the bigger guilds running the competition and squashing smaller teams. But as Liu Yi's victory registered across the arena, those 2 players went completely silent. They stared. A level 1 player with basic gear had just beaten an opponent 5 levels above him. They could not compute it. Here's the thing though, these 2 weren't just spectators, they were betting on other players for profit. One of them immediately pulled up the backstage garden betting site to check how much they'd raked in. The other couldn't stop analyzing Liu Yi's movements, trying to figure out how a player that low level had pulled off that win. As the countdown to Liu Yi's next fight ticked on, the green-haired one kept his eyes locked on every little move Liu Yi made, muttering that he had found his answer. His partner agreed without looking away either, both of them fixated now, waiting to see which mirror copy Liu Yi would pick next so they could place their bets accordingly. Liu Yi, meanwhile, was looking over his own stats. He had leveled up to 5 and his attributes had doubled across the board. Still felt weak to him. He understood what that meant. He needed to get stronger and he needed to kill the fear of fighting before it killed him. No hesitation. He picked his next opponent. A level 10 mirror copy ranked 55th, known as Strikes. The system dropped him into the arena almost instantly. The 2 guys watching scrambled to lock in their bets, then stopped cold when they saw who his opponent was. Liu Yi had picked the level 10 mirror copy nicknamed Strikes. They couldn't believe it. The green-haired guy snapped straight, fully registering what had just happened. Out of hundreds of other level 10 options, Liu Yi had walked straight up to the strongest one. He started panicking, hoping their bet hadn't been finalized yet. The white-haired guy delivered the bad news. The bet was already placed and locked in. Nothing they could do. He just quietly hoped that if they lost, his friend wouldn't go around telling people about it. The embarrassment alone would be brutal. The bookmaker posted the odds for the fight, displaying the split between bets on Liu Yi and bets on Strikes. The numbers were not encouraging. Total bets on a Strikes victory had blown past 200,000. Every shred of hope those 2 had quietly evaporated. Then, across the arena, Strikes materialized before Liu Yi, katana in hand, decked out in the persistent fighter gear set. And then there was Liu Yi, level 5, holding a pistol and a dagger, wearing starter gear. The countdown began. The moment Liu Yi laid eyes on his opponent, his legs started shaking again. That made him furious. So he solved it the only way that made sense to him and drove the dagger into his own leg to stop it. 2 seconds on the clock. He planted his feet and settled into a fighting stance, dead set on not making the same mistakes twice. The battle started and Liu Yi moved immediately, rushing straight at Strikes, weaving through the attacks as he closed the gap. His pistol packed real stopping power, but his aim still needed work, and Strikes was fast enough to dodge or deflect most of the shots. After a few exchanges, Strikes had seen enough and disarmed Liu Yi in one clean motion. Without a pause, Strikes went for the kill, a blow that should have been impossible to escape, but Liu Yi wasn't done. He activated his special ability and his eyes lit up blue. Liu Yi launched forward in an incredible burst of movement, barely slipping out of the path of Strike's killing blow. He skidded back a few steps, then noticed something. Strikes wasn't chasing him. He had a moment to breathe and read the situation. HP 20 out of 100, cognitive power 28 out of 30. The fight had barely started, and Liu Yi was already one bad decision away from losing. His regular attacks weren't even scratching Strikes, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. He had picked an opponent he genuinely might not be able to beat. He should have gone for something weaker, built up his levels first, instead of throwing himself at the deep end this fast. But even with all of that running through his head, Liu Yi settled back into his stance and found it almost darkly funny how brutal this was. He believed the only way to kill the fear was to keep going through it. No shortcuts. Standing still wasn't an option. He decided to run straight at his enemy, and at one point, he twisted hard to the side, barely dodging a blow that would have wiped out the rest of his health in one hit. But he had completely underestimated Strike's speed. In seconds, Strikes had flanked him. Liu Yi knew the math. He wasn't winning this cleanly. Though he decided to gamble everything. Right before the finishing blow landed, he spun to face Strikes head-on, raised the pistol, and fired. In that final split second, they both landed killing blows on each other. Strike's katana cut Liu Yi clean in half, while Liu Yi's bullet tore straight through Strike's head. The system ran the numbers. Liu Yi's fatal hit had landed a fraction of a second faster. He was declared the winner. The reward was massive, a huge dump of experience, a pile of money, and a level up. Liu Yi was now level 13. Nearly every attribute jumped to 17, with endurance being the one stingy exception, going up by just a single point. He let out a long, slow exhale. He had been inches from death, and he had won anyway. Then more notifications came flooding in, the biggest one being that he had hit level 10, which meant his rebirth ability had evolved. He could now choose his own development path. Meanwhile, the two guys who had bet on Liu Yi were surrounded. The crowd had them pressed against the wall, and those who lost the bet were demanding every coin. One of them was practically on the verge of tears, begging to just hand over half. But the one-eyed gang wasn't having it, pointed right at them and said there was no half measure here. A loss was a loss. The white-haired guy finally snapped, yelling that he couldn't believe they had been acting like they already won before the result was even confirmed. Gang pointed confidently at the board and declared that Strikes couldn't possibly lose to some rookie, and if that somehow happened, he was ready to flip the whole betting system upside down. At that point, Strikes was considered one of the top-ranked level 10 mirror copies in the game. Then the board updated and Strikes had lost. The crowd went dead silent, mouths hanging open. Their entire worldview had just collapsed in real time. The green-haired guy erupted, beaming, practically vibrating with excitement. Both friends were ecstatic. They had actually won. Back in the arena, Liu Yi was walking out of the arena victorious. A list appeared before him, something he hadn't seen before. He didn't fully understand what it was yet, but he made a note of it and moved on. As he was logging out, his sister knocked and poked her head into his room, calling him for dinner. In the kitchen, Liu Yi sat down and immediately started eating, barely pausing. His sister Yun cheerfully mentioned she had made his favorite mushroom dish. He didn't respond. His mind was still deep in UN world. Specifically, he was turning over 2 new skills he had just discovered. The first was Invasion Flame, a fascinating trade-off. Damage per second dropped from 50 to 25, but the total damage output climbed to around 250 health points. Beyond the skills, Liu Yi was also thinking through the bigger picture, the threats other players posed, and whether it was time to start thinking about building his own team. After wolfing down his food, he thanked his sister and headed straight back to his room. She blinked at the plate. He had barely touched a single serving. It stung a little. She sighed and thought that maybe she'd need to find someone else to cook for. We're back in UN world now, specifically in the Mirror Kingdom. A man was on his knees at Gang Z's feet, begging to at least keep half the money, just like he had offered earlier. But this guy wasn't done making his case. He kept at it, explaining that the money he had bet on Strikes wasn't even his to lose. It belonged to his family. If it was all gone, there would be serious consequences waiting for him. Gangzi looked down at him with pure contempt and pointed out that just a minute ago, he had flat out refused that same offer and now he was crawling back with it. Before he could finish the thought, a red-haired guy appeared out of nowhere and slammed Gangzi's head into the wall, informing him that every coin lost in the strikes bet needed to come back. The red-haired guy's name was Jack from the New Order Guild, the group that ran the Mirror Kingdom. Gangzi was pinned against the wall, scrambling to explain that he had nothing to do with Liu Yi beating strikes, he had only placed the bet. He didn't know Liu Yi was going to target the strikes copy. Jack didn't care about any of that. He said plainly that the white-haired guy was the one who profited, and even if he escaped consequences here in the game, things would be handled very differently in the real world. Gangzi, desperate to avoid any real-world trouble, offered up every coin he had won from the bet. Jack paused, then refused it entirely. Let the man go. Gangzi stood there confused, trying to figure out what Jack could possibly want instead since he had nothing else to offer. Jack just looked at him with a cold smile and said there was a favor Gangzi would owe him. With no real options, Gangzi had no choice but to agree. Back to our hero, who had logged back into the game after dinner, ready to keep climbing. He knew he couldn't afford to slow down. Judgment Day was coming and he needed to be ready for it. A notification appeared confirming Liu Yi's decision to upgrade the Kai Heal skill. He confirmed it without hesitating and 3 notifications hit him back to back. The first detailed the skill he had just chosen. The second confirmed that his combat assessment was complete. His combat power now sat at 15.6. On top of that, he had received a new title, Low-Level Warrior. But the biggest surprise was this: by choosing that skill, he had unlocked a dual attribute and several of his stats had shot up considerably. Looking over the numbers, he was genuinely stunned. Some attributes had climbed far beyond what he expected. It brought back a memory from his previous life, how drastically weak he had become after pushing past level 100. Now at just level 13, his new traits and bonuses had put him on par with a level 26 character. That wasn't nothing. Liu Yi's mind drifted to a specific question: could he actually take down level 20 strikes with the strength he had now? And just like that, the uncertainty was gone. Something had shifted in him. The insecure guy who had dragged himself through days of grinding had given way to someone with a point to prove. He wanted to test himself against strikes, wanted to see exactly where he stood. A notification appeared asking him to confirm the battle against strikes. He accepted immediately. Within seconds of him selecting his opponent, bets started flooding into local bookmakers and the player chat began buzzing. 2 guys Jack had sent out were already at work, spreading the word and hyping up the odds. One of them went all in on Liu Yi to win, which made the golden-haired man furious. They weren't supposed to be placing personal bets, but the white-haired one was convinced Jack couldn't touch them for it. Even if Jack wanted to retaliate, he wouldn't get backup from his own group, the New Order. The blonde noticed his friend's smug little grin and put it together. Jack had clearly forced him to push the odds in Liu Yi's favor. What he couldn't figure out was why, since it was obvious no one in their right mind would bet on Liu Yi and the returns would be laughable. But the guy didn't explain. His job was to stir things up and that was all. The scene cut to the battle arena inside the Mirror Realm, 10 seconds until it began. In one corner, Strike's level 20 dual katanas advanced armor. In the other, Liu Yi level 13 pistol dagger starter gear. Liu Yi ran through the math. With enough cognitive power in reserve, he could time things precisely, read Strike's patterns, and find the perfect window to close this out. The system announced the battle's start. Liu Yi didn't wait, he opened fire immediately. Strikes deflected bullet after bullet with the dual katanas barely breaking stride. As he attacked, Liu Yi kept pushing closer, parrying incoming blows as he moved in. And then something clicked. The double attributes had practically erased the strength gap between them. That realization landed like a shot of adrenaline. High-level opponents weren't going to feel like brick walls anymore. He weaved from side to side, keeping to his pistol, reflecting on just how different this felt compared to his earlier fights. He let Strikes close the distance, drew her into dagger range, then lined up a headshot, planning to end it in the final seconds. He was smiling, he could see the finish line. Strikes, on the other hand, was frozen. She couldn't process the fact that this low-level nobody was actually threatening her. The paralysis was real. But then Liu Yi saw her face clearly and something stopped him cold. He hesitated. His finger didn't pull the trigger. That hesitation gave Strikes just enough time to attempt a counter. Liu Yi dodged back cleanly, avoiding the hit, but the moment had passed. A wave of anger crashed over him as his mind locked onto something. He clutched his head, frozen in place, furious at himself. Why hadn't he taken the shot? He turned it over and landed on the ugly truth. He was scared, plain and simple. He was afraid of taking a life even in a game. Looking at Strikes and the weapon in his own hand, Liu Yi felt the weight of it. He feared he would never be able to take control of his own fate, that he'd always be the guy who flinched, who let fear make his decisions. His grip tightened around the gun because he understood his future was being decided right here in this moment. And across from him, Strikes understood it too. Only one of them was walking out of this, and everything about the protagonist's path hung on what happened next. Both of them made the same decision at the same time: close the gap and end it. Strikes moved first with a blow aimed at Liu Yi's neck, a clean decapitation if it landed. But Liu Yi slipped it, moving fast and circling behind her. He grabbed her by the head, raised the gun, and in that moment everything was clear. He had already crossed the line. He wasn't that scared, hesitant person anymore. Liu Yi pulled the trigger. 3 notifications appeared instantly. First, Strikes had been defeated. Second, his level had increased. Third, he had hit level 20 and could now choose how to develop his power further. His expression was stone cold. He had not just grown stronger, he had pulled ahead of every other player. Out in the lobby, the people who had bet on Liu Yi were losing their minds. They had actually won. Again, then the green-haired guy pointed something out. The bets hadn't affected anyone else. Jack had opened a second round of bets on a level 20 Strikes and she had still lost to Liu Yi. Everyone now knew what this guy was capable of. He started doing the math out loud. After defeating a level 20 Strikes, Liu Yi had probably landed somewhere around level 22 or 23, which meant the only mirror copy left that could challenge him was the level 30 Strikes. And the rewards for beating her were in a completely different league. The hero already knew what was coming. It was Strikes again, but neither of them could figure out how Liu Yi could possibly be confident enough to go after the level 30 Strikes copy. The general assumption was that the moment he stepped into that fight he'd get crushed and there'd be nothing they could do about it. Back in the mirror realm, Liu Yi had returned and he felt it now. He wasn't just keeping up anymore, he was ahead. He pulled up the tournament board. Right at the top, holding first place, was the level 30 mirror copy of Strikes. He had already proven he could outfight players above his level, but this was different. The level 30 Strikes had a reputation. Most players called her unbeatable. If he wanted to prove himself beyond any doubt, she was the one he had to go through. Rumors were already circulating around him before he even made his move. Someone had apparently reset their entire account just to try taking down the level 30 Strikes and still lost. The titles she held, Invincible Copy, Strongest Fighter, weren't given out for show. More importantly, he heard that the New Order Guild had built a significant chunk of its power and reputation around her undefeated record. Liu Yi heard all of it. And then he pulled up the system anyway, a look in his eyes that made it very clear he had already made up his mind. The system prompted him. Did he really want to enter the battle against the level 30 mirror copy of Strikes? He didn't even blink, confirmed it, and the system transferred him immediately. From a distance, Jack had been watching Liu Yi move. The moment he saw who Liu Yi had chosen, he ordered all his people to start pushing bets on a Strikes victory. Cut to the 2 guys. One of them immediately placed a bet on Liu Yi to win, which made the green-haired man's patience snap completely. He was convinced Liu Yi had no shot against a level 30 Strikes. But his white-haired friend ignored him entirely, simply saying he believed in Liu Yi. The arena, across from Liu Yi, stood the level 30 Strikes waiting. She was carrying a weapon that immediately stood out, a katana called Last Will, and her gear set was called Fierce. Liu Yi was level 23. Pistol, basic dagger, starter gear. On paper, he had absolutely no business being in this fight. Then a notification popped up. His intelligence stat had just broken past 100 points, granting him a bonus to his intelligence knowledge power. He got absorbed in reading it. He didn't notice the battle had already started. Strikes came in the moment the timer hit 0 and landed a hit for 4,011 damage. Liu Yi's health dropped to 18. He stared at the number, stunned. He hadn't even seen her move. The second strike came immediately and should have ended him right there. Somehow he got the dagger up in time and blocked it. He survived, barely. Frustration started building with every passing second. He understood now how serious this was. One beat slower on that block and it would have been over with no chance to heal. He forced the next attack aside and jumped back, firing his pistol in the same motion. Every bullet flew with sharp, focused precision. He didn't want this dragging out. He needed to close it fast. But every attempt to land a hit was useless. Strikes was slipping every shot like they were moving in slow motion for her, then in one single movement. Strikes closed the entire distance between them, ready to end the fight. Liu Yi had no time to react. Strikes shrugged off the dagger strike like it was nothing and still managed to connect with a blow that forced Liu Yi into a constant cycle of healing just to stay in the fight. He couldn't block the attack cleanly. If he hadn't reacted in that exact split second, it would have been over. But he recovered just in time, ducked, sidestepped, slipped out of the path of Strike's follow-through. He immediately created space between them and tried once more to land a pistol shot. Then Liu Yi's mind went somewhere else for just a moment. He ran the numbers. His stats were equivalent to a level 46 player and Strike's was still outpacing him, but as that thought settled, something else followed. He was not done. He had a read on Strike's now. If that was the ceiling of her power, he could pour on enough damage in a matter of seconds to flip this entire fight around. That was when Liu Yi decided to use the study of blessing skill. The skill amplified all of the target's stats and activated a unique empowered state lasting exactly 1 minute. He had also studied the curse counterpart, which could trigger one of 10 debilitating effects: weakness, aging, lethargy, stupidity, fatigue, poisoning, hallucinations, altered perception, chaos, and madness. A notification confirmed it. The blessing had been acquired. His current combat power read 15, but that number was about to become irrelevant. His stats multiplied. Every number on his sheet surged, and suddenly the gap between him and Strike's looked very different. Liu Yi didn't wait. He called out the activation, knowing full well he wasn't high enough level to beat Strike's through raw level advantage. But his boosted stats? That was a different story. The notification confirmed it. 400 cognitive power points spent, and for exactly 1 minute all his stats had increased by 200. After that, they'd returned to baseline. A white aura ignited around him, radiating something that made every player watching take a step back. That aura gave him the push he needed. 1 minute, that was all he had, and it was enough to finish this. Strike's froze, caught completely off guard, bracing herself, unsure what Liu Yi's next move would be, but Strike's recovered fast. She decided not to wait around and shot forward at full speed, intent on ending Liu Yi before whatever was happening could fully develop. A thought crossed Liu Yi's mind in that moment. Once he put Strike's down, everyone would know. The abilities he had been hiding would be undeniable. He'd be the strongest player in the server, but he snapped back into focus. Eyes locking onto Strike's, closing in fast, already weaving to avoid her. But dodging alone wasn't cutting it. She was already in range. Liu Yi raised his pistol and fired. The first bullet caught Strike's in the chest and stopped her momentum cold. She actually looked confused. Liu Yi didn't give her time to recover. He kept pulling the trigger, shot after shot, relentless. Within seconds, more than 10 bullet holes had opened up across Strike's body. By all logic, she should have been on the ground. Instead, she was completely fine, fully regenerated, standing there with a smile like nothing had happened. She seemed to have figured it out. As Liu Yi reloaded, Strike's had already analyzed him. His stats were far above what any player at his level should have, and he had passive skills that activated at critical moments. That was the real core of Strike's power, her adaptive intelligence. And on top of all that, the Mirror Kingdom system actively worked against players, making victories even harder to earn. Liu Yi understood he was operating completely outside the expected rules. He reset his stance. The buff's duration was ticking down, and he needed to end this before it ran out. With time bleeding away, Liu Yi committed fully and went on the offensive. He drove forward, pressing Strike's with everything he had. 25 seconds left. He attacked knowing that losing was not something he was willing to accept. His goal wasn't just this fight, it was everything he had failed to do in his past life. Taking control of his fate once and for all. Every new strike from Liu Yi had Strike's moving forward, shrinking the distance between them. 15 seconds left. Liu Yi leaped back to reset, then immediately countered. He wasn't giving Strike's a single moment to breathe. Attack, parry, move, repeat. With just a few seconds left on the buff, a bullet found its mark straight to the forehead, blowing straight through Strike's armor. Strike's began shaking violently. Her weapon slipped from her hands. The attack stopped. And then, completely drained, she collapsed. The system notification dissolved into the air. The body lay still on the ground. Liu Yi stood over it. He couldn't fully believe what he had just done, defeated the most powerful opponent the mirror world had to offer. He could already imagine the reaction. They'd call him the strongest, the one who took down a level 30 Strike's, the player with skills so hidden and so powerful that he had become untouchable, an invincible warrior. Someone in the crowd remarked that titles like that meant nothing to actual level 30 players, since those players existed in an entirely different tier of strength. One spectator illustrated the point: a level 30 player to the protagonist would be, at best, the ground beneath his feet. In other words, completely out of his reach. Liu Yi's imagination ran with it, and his confidence soared even higher after that victory. For just a moment, he let himself enjoy it. Then several notifications stacked up on his interface. The first congratulated him on defeating Strike's. The second detailed his reward, a massive haul of money and experience. He couldn't contain the feeling rising in his chest, and it wasn't just the money or the levels. He had conquered something inside himself. The system teleported him back to the Mirror Kingdom lobby. In the waiting area, Jack had watched every second of that fight. He stood there unable to believe that Liu Yi had actually taken down the Mirror Kingdom's strongest copy. What pushed him over the edge wasn't the loss itself, it was every coin he had dumped into betting on strikes. Meanwhile, the two players who had backed Liu Yi were completely losing it, jumping, yelling, the whole thing. The white-haired one turned to everyone around him with a massive grin and said he had been right about Liu Yi all along and that his bet had paid off. He followed it up by saying that from now on, everyone should trust their gut. His friend grabbed his arm before he could enjoy it any further, told him it was way too early to celebrate because a lot could still go sideways. He strongly suggested they both log off immediately and in real life move to a different apartment before Jack's people tracked them down. Scene shift, the real world, the protagonist's house. He's sitting on his bed, quietly replaying the victory over strikes in his head, the Mirror Kingdom's undefeated champion, taken down. The door opens, a girl steps in from the other room and tells him he must be starving, inviting him to eat. He had something else in mind. He smiled and told her the two of them were going out, he was taking her for barbecue. As they headed down the stairs, she asked where he had gotten the money. Restaurants weren't exactly cheap for them. He laughed and told her she wouldn't believe it. He had won a big sum in the game and that meant they had something worth celebrating. She accepted without pressing for details. The next day, back at the protagonist's place, he sat down and made an online purchase. Order confirmed. Estimated delivery 2 months. He stared at that. In just 24 days, UN world was going to merge with reality. 2 months was completely useless to him. But the nearest store he checked was out of stock. There was no shortcut. Instead of spiraling about it, he refocused. He was going to have to work even harder in the time he had. No other option. The scene shifts. 2 girls were walking along the waterfront, both visibly flustered as practically every passerby turned to stare at them. The best friend cut straight to it. Why exactly had Liu Yi asked the girl out on a date? Her mind started filling in worst-case scenarios, convinced something had gone wrong. Yun, meanwhile, was walking around with the biggest smile imaginable, saying nothing for a moment while she played out the whole plan in her head. She was imagining how she would introduce her brother to her friend, because that was the real goal here. The girl was incredibly attractive, came from a good family, and had a genuinely wonderful personality. If she became Liu Yi's fiancé, Yun could finally stop worrying about him. Coming back to Earth, Yun smiled and said her brother had just missed her, that's why he wanted to see her. Her friend, not entirely buying it, asked where Yun had even been lately since she had gone completely silent in the group chat. Yun started to wonder if her friend might already have a boyfriend, but even if that were true, it wouldn't change her plans. The meetup with Liu Yi was happening. Her friend Neon sighed, adjusted her cap, and said she genuinely didn't even know how to explain it. Then out of nowhere, she just blurted it out. Her parents were forcing her to play some online game. Yun blinked. She had no idea how to respond to that. Meanwhile, across town at a local bar, Jack was in a rage. He had called over a red-haired girl to calm him down and instead struck her. The blow was brutal. She hit the floor hard. Even as she lay there struggling to stay conscious, Jack kept going. He despised her attempt to soothe him. It felt like pity to him, and that made everything worse. People nearby had stopped and were watching, their outrage obvious. But nobody moved. This wasn't the first time they'd seen Jack like this. He clocked the stares and the whispers and rounded on the crowd, demanding to know what they were muttering about. Nobody answered. Instead, one by one, they all turned and scattered in different directions, making sure they weren't next. Still seething, Jack spat on the girl, then reached for his phone. And the call came in before he could even dial. Someone on the other end called him by name. He picked up immediately and cut straight to it. Had they found the protagonist's address? No, but the person said they had a plan. Jack listened carefully, then asked if the plan was actually airtight. When the answer came back as 100% guaranteed, something in Jack's face shifted. The fury in his eyes made it very clear he wanted Liu Yi and he wasn't stopping until he got him. With a voice that carried pure malice, Jack said the moment they found him, he'd send the rest of the money immediately. The call ended. Scene shift to Liu Yi, who had just logged back into the game. He stood outside the Mirror Kingdom building, thinking it through. The mirror copies maxed out at level 30. At his current level, there was nothing left here that could push him. The enemies were simply too weak. Time to move on. He turned and started walking toward the ruined kingdom, a place where he could actually grow. Then he caught a glimpse of his own appearance and stopped. He was still wearing starter armor. That needed to change before he went anywhere serious. Liu Yi headed to a weapons shop. As he approached the display window, a system panel opened up showing everything available for purchase. Then he saw the prices and froze for a few seconds. The look on his face said everything. He simply could not afford any of it. He turned around and walked back out, continuing through the Mirror Kingdom with a quiet sigh. It didn't take long to figure out the next problem. There was no way to gather crafting materials in the Mirror Kingdom either. So the Ruined Kingdom was the move. He could farm materials there and craft level 20 gear himself. He had the coin to buy level 20 equipment outright, but he wasn't in a rush to spend it, especially since he'd be hitting level 30 soon enough, making that gear obsolete fast. And he needed to be careful with real-world money too. So he set off for the Ruined Kingdom with one clear secondary goal: find a team. Moving with a group would speed everything up and get him geared faster. When he arrived, the place was buzzing, teams recruiting players left and right, looking for people to run dungeons at different difficulty levels. Some were happy to take level 20 players, others were strictly looking for level 30s for the harder raids. He hung back for a moment and caught a conversation between two players nearby. They were talking about a recent New Order guild raid on the level 40 Chaos dungeon. 10 players went in, all 10 came out with their stats completely reset. Liu Yi already knew the rules. Dungeons had 4 fixed restrictions regardless of team size, and the more players you brought, the bigger the reward at the end. But once you were inside, there was no leaving until it was cleared, and in the Ruined Kingdom specifically, dying didn't just cost you experience. It reset everything, total loss of gear included. Teams weren't being selective for fun, they had to be. With the skills he had, Liu Yi was confident he'd be accepted without much trouble. He walked up to the first recruiter and was turned down immediately. Level 30 players only. He tried the next group, rejected, his gear wasn't up to standard. Third attempt, they didn't even let him speak. The party was already full, he dropped to his knees. After everything, after defeating Strikes, a level 30 mirror copy, nobody wanted him. He genuinely couldn't wrap his head around it. His strength had been proven. It should have counted for something, regardless of what his level number or his gear looked like. Discouraged, he started considering the slow route, grind the easier dungeons for basic gear and work his way up. He hated the idea, but it was looking like the only path. He forced himself back to his feet and was about to commit to that plan when footsteps approached from behind. Then a voice announcing that a team had one spot open. Liu Yi turned around, curious, not sure yet if the offer was even directed at him. Standing there was Jack, smiling. With a calm, calculated expression, Jack told him there was a slot available in their party for a level 35 dungeon, a 10-player run. Liu Yi looked at him and something immediately felt off. Still, Jack kept the pitch going. His team was more than strong enough to handle the dungeon on their own. They just needed one more player to activate the raid portal. Liu Yi was surprised both by the offer and by a nagging sense of familiarity he couldn't place. He felt like he had seen Jack somewhere before, he just couldn't remember where. Jack didn't give him time to think it through. He said plainly if Liu Yi wasn't interested, he'd find someone else. Not willing to let the opportunity slip, Liu Yi cut him off and accepted on the spot. Jack gave a casual wave of his hand and told him to follow. Together, they made their way to the entrance of the level 30 portal, a dungeon built for a full party of 10. When they arrived at the meeting point near the ruined royal portal, they walked into a crowd. The surrounding players were geared up impressively, and more than a few of them side-eyed Jack's recruitment choice with open skepticism. Nobody expected their leader to show up with a rookie carrying nothing but a basic pistol. Liu Yi scanned the group and immediately registered that these people were not messing around. The purple gear on more than half the team told him everything: timeless rarity. These weren't casual players. He held his head for a moment, running quiet calculations, and couldn't help but wonder if he could walk away from this with some of their gear. Then one of the players shouted that since everyone was finally here, they should move out immediately. He had his eyes set on level 40 and wasn't about to waste another second. A bald man strolled over with a grin and pointed out that once they hit level 40, they'd need to swap their gear anyway, and offered to pass his old stuff down to the group when that happened. The impatient player just smiled and shot it down flat. Unless someone was willing to buff his weapon with 3 rare items from their inventory, which, predictably, nobody was, the group started moving toward the portal with Liu Yi trailing a step behind, quietly observing. They clearly all knew each other well, the kind of team that had run together long enough to not need words. What he couldn't figure out was why they had called him in for this particular mission. Then he caught it, the subtle, knowing smiles passing between them. This so-called friendship had an agenda written all over it. The portal opened and beyond it stretched a vast desert, empty in every direction except for a single mysterious crystal sitting at the center. Jack and one other player were first through the portal and immediately began scanning the area. It didn't take long for one of the team members to read the mission objective: protect the crystal. Jack took command without hesitation, ordering everyone to form up around the crystal and lock it down. Everyone moved into position, everyone except Liu Yi, who held back for a moment. Jack clocked it immediately and issued a warning. Anyone who let a monster reach the crystal would be covering the damages out of their own pocket. Liu Yi noted the team's organization with quiet surprise, though he didn't let it show. Still in no rush to commit to a position, he took a moment to study the crystal. Then a notification blinked into view. The mission was loading. Seconds later, a follow-up message confirmed the objective: defend the crystal through 3 waves of enemies. At the bottom of the screen, the crystal's health bar sat alongside the failure penalty, death for every player in the party. Before he could finish reading, someone shouted that the monsters were incoming. Liu Yi scanned the desert, nothing but thick fog rolling across the sand. But the longer he looked, the more wrong it felt. This fog hadn't rolled in naturally, the monsters were generating it themselves. Then something burst out of it at speed, a creature shaped like a spider but with fangs that were genuinely absurd in size. The bald man barked at Liu Yi to get closer to the crystal, making it clear that ignoring orders in here could get him killed. Liu Yi didn't argue, he moved. Meanwhile, a swarm of monstrous beetles closed in on the bald man, who stood there gripping an enormous axe like he'd been waiting for exactly this. It looked like he was about to be overwhelmed, but that wasn't the plan he had in mind at all. One swing of that axe and several beetles ceased to exist simultaneously. Liu Yi watched the rest of the team work. They were dismantling wave after wave of oversized beetles like it was routine. Their coordination was seamless. No wasted movement, no overlapping mistakes. This group knew exactly what they were doing. Liu Yi quietly acknowledged it. He'd only get in the way if he forced himself into their rhythm. Better to hold his position and not break what was already working. Jack was cutting through monsters methodically, until he suddenly stopped and exchanged a look with his sword-wielding teammate. No words, just a glance. The ally understood immediately. Let one through, let it reach the protagonist. Without missing a beat, he stepped aside and let the next monster that came at him slip past, selling the miss like he simply hadn't had the timing. The spider-like creature made a beeline for Liu Yi and the crystal. Liu Yi didn't hesitate. He could hear the others calling out that a monster had gotten through, that he needed to protect the crystal. He was already on it. A few seconds later, the creature was down. And in that moment, Liu Yi noted it. For all their coordination and gear, their raw individual strength was average at best. They were even in the same league as the strike's copy he had taken down. A notification confirmed the first wave had been cleared. The second would begin in 10 minutes. With the monsters gone, the group sat down to recover. One of them brought up Liu Yi, said that at first glance, nobody would peg him as someone capable of this. Taking down a monster 10 levels above him with beginner gear wasn't something your average player pulled off. The swordsman who'd let the monster slip through was muttering about his own mistake, said if their 10th member hadn't gone AWOL, there wouldn't have been a gap in the line to begin with. The bald man told him to drop it. Problem solved, move on. He then turned to Liu Yi and told him directly, next wave he'd be fighting alongside the rest of them on the defense line. No more standing back. The guy sitting next to Liu Yi leaned over and floated the idea of bringing him into the team permanently, said it would save him the headache of trying to build his own party from scratch. He asked Liu Yi straight up what he thought about joining the group. That way they could start taking on high-level content together. Liu Yi actually liked the idea. For a brief moment, he seriously considered saying yes right there. Right after he nodded, the man in black armor turned to Jack and asked what he thought about Liu Yi joining them permanently. Jack smiled and said he had no problem with it, but there were conditions. New members were required to hand over their phone number and real-world address. For security purposes, he explained, to prevent situations like what they'd dealt with before. Liu Yi said nothing, he just kept listening. Jack went on, talked about how hard they'd worked to get their gear, only for some guy named Sam to take everything for himself. That's why they were short-handed dealing with the monsters now. If Liu Yi wanted in, those were the terms. Liu Yi went quiet. He didn't need anyone to spell it out. He had already read the room. The smiles Jack and his people exchanged after saying that were just a little too satisfied, and that only confirmed what Liu Yi had already suspected. They said their goal all along had been to bring him into the raid, and for a few seconds the whole group went still, waiting to see how he'd respond. Liu Yi got to his feet quickly and took a long look around the hall. The sheer number of mid-level players positioned nearby made it obvious this wasn't random. They had picked him deliberately. Walked him through a series of carefully staged steps: friendly recruitment, a deliberately allowed monster, and now an invitation to join the team. Every move designed to get one thing: his real-world address. Liu Yi smiled and laid it out plainly. Based on everything that had happened, this was clearly an attempt to extract his personal information. He looked directly at Jack, who was radiating barely contained fury, and kept talking. He suggested that Jack was probably the one running the New Order Guild's Mirror Realm operations. Before agreeing to come here, he had caught a conversation between two players talking about the New Order Guild, specifically how the guild had tracked down the real-world address of a 20-year-old who had defeated Strikes. Nobody had seen that player since. Still smiling, Liu Yi said he was honestly flattered that beating the level 30 Strikes had gotten him this much attention. Everything clicked into place. Jack had assembled this whole setup to locate him in the real world and deal with him there. Jack tried to keep his composure and claimed Liu Yi must have him confused with someone else. Liu Yi didn't buy it for a second. He said plainly he never actually had any intention of joining their team. He had come for the experience and the money that came with running alongside a squad this strong. But now that their real agenda was out in the open, there was no point pretending. After all, they were enemies, and enemies needed to be handled. Jack rose to his feet, eyes locked on Liu Yi with a look that could curdle steel. The entire team closed in around him. Then Jack spoke, mocking, voice dripping with contempt, asking if Liu Yi genuinely believed he could take on 9 players, every single one of them 10 levels above him. One of the group lunged at Liu Yi from behind, screaming that he had some nerve. In that same instant, a notification flashed before Liu Yi. 30 power points spent, next attack amplified by 1,500 damage. Remaining power 414, cognition 450. The attacker flew several feet forward and hit the ground dead. The room went silent. In a single strike, Liu Yi had dropped someone 10 levels above him. Nobody moved. They had surrounded him, and not one of them had expected that. Then something strange began happening to the dead player's body. It started to glow, pulsing with an intense blue light as if it were absorbing energy and converting it into something else entirely. When the transformation finished, a sphere materialized in front of Liu Yi, a blue military pearl. The system added a note: military pearls drop when a player is defeated, with a chance to yield a random item from the dead player's equipment or backpack. Liu Yi picked it up, expression completely flat, and asked what exactly was so impossible about taking on 9 players. Jack was past furious. He was ready to tear Liu Yi apart with his bare hands. To him, the kid was being delusional. He ordered everyone to rush Liu Yi at once and bury him as fast as possible. They all charged. What they didn't account for was that Liu Yi had stopped extending mercy the moment this started. The first to fall was a girl just a few seconds in. Then the next, and the next after that. Liu Yi moved through them methodically, one by one. He understood what he was doing, taking away their ability to survive. He had no pleasure in it, but he had no alternative either. He couldn't die here. His sister had no way of identifying these players on her own. As long as that was true, he had to keep getting stronger, no exceptions. With his current strength, he still wasn't ready to protect her when UN World crossed into reality. The only answer was to keep climbing all the way to the top, and anyone who might become a threat to that goal later needed to be removed now. So Liu Yi kept walking forward, through the bodies piling up around him. Jack and the remnants of his squad were frozen, unable to understand why none of their attacks were landing. Their levels were higher, their gear was better, it shouldn't have been possible. The frustration in the room was palpable. Even Jack, who had already figured out Liu Yi was no ordinary player, hadn't expected this. His remaining allies started trying to talk Liu Yi down, arguing that if he kept killing them, nobody would be able to finish the dungeon and everyone would lose their resources. Liu Yi told them it didn't matter to him. He could head to the secret mirror zone and recover everything he lost in a single day. For them, it was a completely different story. Their equipment would be gone and they didn't have the strength to beat the Mirror Realm characters to get it back. Jack, seething, threatened to rally people to block Liu Yi from entering the secret mirror zone entirely. Liu Yi laughed, then kept killing. Jack couldn't believe what he was watching. He tried to order his people to fall back and stop taking losses, but before the words were even out of his mouth, 2 more players behind him were already dead. As his allies fell one by one, a memory surfaced in Jack's mind, a meeting with someone important. Someone who had told him they needed to remain the top players in UN World. Whatever it took to hold that position didn't matter, that person would back them up completely. But that same person had added a condition: if they ever failed, the support would be pulled immediately. Every crime they had committed would be exposed and punishment would come swiftly. When Jack snapped back to the present, he was alone. Everyone else was down, only he remained. Liu Yi turned to finish the job. Jack dropped to his knees, begging, hands out, voice cracking, pleading for Liu Yi not to kill him. Liu Yi said nothing, just stared at him, and somehow that silence made Jack feel more pathetic than any words could have. Jack shifted tactics, said if Liu Yi let him live, he would reveal a secret about UN World. Liu Yi smiled and told him to start talking, no holding back. Jack said he needed a promise first, that Liu Yi would finish him off right after he spoke. Instead of getting a response, he got launched several meters across the ground. Liu Yi said simply. Since Jack didn't want to talk, maybe it was better he moved on to the next world. He didn't really need the secret that badly anymore. Jack landed hard some distance away, but he didn't dissolve into pearls, no death screen. He was still alive. He pushed himself up shakily, trembling from the impact, and Liu Yi raised an eyebrow. That was a direct hit. How was he still standing? Then, from somewhere deep across the desert, a sound. Liu Yi registered it instantly. The second wave was starting. Jack used the moment to talk. He said Liu Yi must already know something about UN World's secrets. Otherwise, there was no explaining how he'd gotten this strong. What genuinely floored Jack was that even he couldn't handle Liu Yi. Because of that, he was going to take this straight to his superiors. Once that happened, Liu Yi wouldn't just be dealing with Jack anymore. He'd be facing people who would reset him back to level 1 without breaking a sweat. Still getting to his feet, Jack kept going, asked if Liu Yi really thought he could stand up against people far above Jack's own level. Very few players had ever managed to level up the way Liu Yi had. And once whatever secret he was sitting on became obsolete, Jack was convinced his advantage would disappear with it. Then the begging started again. Jack asked Liu Yi to let him walk. In exchange, he'd give up the secret, and together they could use Liu Yi's strength to clear the rest of the dungeon. Liu Yi just smiled and asked why Jack assumed he was going to die or that he couldn't clear this dungeon alone. Jack stared at him like he'd said something in a foreign language. Liu Yi was level 28. No matter how freakishly strong he was, everyone had a ceiling. At least that's what Jack believed. Then Liu Yi asked, casually like he was making small talk, what if he had level 56 gear? Clearing a level 35 dungeon wouldn't exactly be a challenge, would it? Jack blinked. He genuinely didn't know how to process that. Liu Yi held up 2 pearls and asked if these happened to be gear Jack wasn't expecting him to have. Jack's eyes locked onto the blue orb in Liu Yi's hands. The color drained from his face. He couldn't speak. The shock was written across every feature. With a confident grin, Liu Yi called out for the blue orb to open and release its contents. In an instant, Liu Yi was standing in black and yellow armor. A frost tank top covered his upper body, purple ranked, loaded with buffs that were anything but subtle. A purple-ranked rapid combat suit wrapped his entire frame, boosting resistance, strength, agility, and armor, requiring level 30 to equip. Combat gloves covered his hands, hitting the same attributes but shifting focus toward sensation, with strength dropped from the equation. Violet-ranked high-speed combat boots pushed his agility into a completely different bracket. And the crown jewel, a purple-ranked beam katana, granting Liu Yi a flat 160 attack power bonus along with a 30-point bump to his defense. By combat power calculations, he was now operating at the level of a level 46 player. He glanced at what was left of Jack's crew and remarked that he supposed he owed them a thank you. They had handed him a full gear upgrade, completely free of charge. His combat capabilities had more than tripled in the span of minutes. A living demonstration of what happens when your opponents gift you the very tools to destroy them. Jack stood there completely frozen. He had watched Liu Yi's stats nearly triple in real time and still couldn't make his brain accept it. Then the shock curdled into something uglier, rage, pure burning hatred. He started shouting. It didn't matter how strong Liu Yi had gotten, there was no way he was clearing this dungeon alone. It was flat out impossible. All around them, the sound of approaching monsters was already building, closing in fast. Then one of them reached the crystal and lunged. Liu Yi dealt with anything that came near without even a change in expression. One ant down and suddenly hundreds more spilled in from behind, all targeting him and the crystal, all trying to reset his level to 0. Liu Yi wasn't giving up an inch. He cut through them one by one, methodical and relentless, holding the thought of his sister in the back of his mind the whole time. Losing wasn't an option. Thanks to the pearl's effect, he didn't need to burn any cognitive power to keep clearing the insects pouring in from every direction. He held the line around the crystal, facing enemies from all angles, not wavering. Everything was on the line. He needed this win. He kept cutting them down one after another. The bodies piled up, but the wave showed absolutely no sign of ending. Then his health took a steep dive, dropping dangerously close to 0. He triggered his healing ability, topped himself off, and kept fighting like nothing had happened. Jack, still alive on the sidelines, had been picking off a few ants here and there. He noticed Liu Yi's health cratering and then watched it refill almost instantly. He couldn't believe it. He shouted that it didn't matter. Liu Yi had to be burning through rare potions and that supply wasn't infinite. Jack just needed to dodge, outlast him, and wait for him to run dry. Liu Yi didn't even glance in his direction. There were monsters to kill. Jack kept yelling that Liu Yi would pay for his arrogance. Liu Yi smiled and told him to focus on staying alive himself. He said he had the situation handled, and even if Jack dropped to his knees and begged, it wasn't going to change a single thing. That just made Jack angrier. He could not wrap his head around how someone could be this composed in the middle of a disaster like this. Then Jack caught movement in his peripheral vision, an ant coming at him from the side. He killed it before it could land. Liu Yi, meanwhile, continued carving through monsters at an almost mechanical pace. His health dipped critically low again, he healed again, back into the fight without missing a beat. Hours passed. Liu Yi's eyes never changed, no hesitation, no desperation, just the work and the growing field of corpses surrounding him, and yet the creatures kept coming for the crystal, endless and relentless. Jack stared at the mountain of dead monsters and did the math. The volume of healing Liu Yi had burned through was impossible by normal inventory limits. No player could carry that many potions into a dungeon. Something else was going on. While Jack was trying to puzzle it out, he stopped paying attention and a monster grabbed his arm and tore into him. His health cratered instantly. He reached for a potion on reflex. His inventory was empty. The realization hit him like ice water. No health, no resources, enemies closing in from every side. He had nothing left to fight with. The monsters swarmed him, tearing into every part of him they could reach, relentless and indifferent. Even then, even with death seconds away, what consumed Jack most was the injustice of it, the idea of dying before he got to watch Liu Yi fall. He looked over one last time. Liu Yi was still standing, still fighting, still winning. Jack made himself a promise as the screen began to fade. Liu Yi would answer for this the moment he respawned in the lobby. Liu Yi watched it all with a calm expression and not an ounce of fatigue. If anything, he was enjoying it. Every monster that came at him was experience. Every wave was a chance to sharpen his instincts. This was exactly how he needed to grow. A moment later, Jack's character was ejected to the lobby, level reset to 0. A notification appeared on Liu Yi's screen. His party had been reduced to one member, himself. By meeting all the dungeon conditions alone, his completion reward would be multiplied by 10. Several more hours of relentless combat later, Liu Yi finally dropped to one knee, chest heaving, trying to pull in a full breath. An almost incomprehensible number of defeated ants lay scattered in every direction, every single one eliminated by him. And then, finally, the wave stopped. The insects pulled back. He looked at the massive bodies and allowed himself one moment of relief. The ants would vanish before the next wave. If they hadn't, finding the crystal underneath that pile would have been a genuine problem. Then, a short distance away, text floated in the air, golden orb. Unlike the blue military pearl, the golden orb granted 3 random items pulled directly from a dead player's inventory. Liu Yi was on his feet in an instant. A genuine smile broke across his face. He hadn't dared hope for a golden orb, but considering who had been running this group, it made sense. The mirror copy manager. For once, the drops had actually delivered. He walked toward it, picked it up, and took stock of where he stood. Cognitive energy was low, not critically, but enough to matter. He had roughly 10 minutes before the final wave, which would recover maybe half his power. Not ideal going into the last round, and he was honest with himself. He shouldn't have gone after Jack's crew so early in the dungeon. He should have saved his resources for this moment. All he could do now was hope the golden orb had something inside that could bridge the gap. He spoke the activation words, and a notification appeared asking him to choose between equipment and items. He reasoned it through. His strength, agility, and armor were all approaching 100 points. If the equipment option could push those 3 stats past the threshold, his combat power would jump significantly. He selected equipment. System confirmed, opening the orb, retrieving contents. First out, a set of purple and gray amber equipment, granting +10 agility and +5 senses. The second item, a matching ring, dropped directly into his right hand. The third item was a purple-class pendulum pistol. It came with 200 strength, 30 wisdom, and a locking ability on top of that. It could either triple the damage of each shot or stun the target, player's choice, and it had an automatic reload function, though it needed a full minute to recharge completely. Liu Yi stood there in stunned silence. He turned the pistol over in his hands, barely believing what he was reading. Every single drop had been useful, not just useful, perfect. New buffs across his entire loadout, and his main weapon had just received a serious upgrade. Today was genuinely his day. He pulled up his stats. 4 of them had crossed the 100-point threshold. That made him genuinely happy. His combat power was now at a level he hadn't expected to reach this fast. He sat with it for a moment and landed on something almost funny. If the people he had killed in this dungeon hadn't come after him, none of this gear would be in his hands right now. So with a smile, he thanked them. He was ready. The only thing still lagging behind was his level. But the moment he defended that crystal through the final wave, he would close that gap and be standing right alongside the top players. Scenes shift, the city at night. We're in a respawn room the kind players wake up in after death. Jack stood in the middle of the room, head bowed, talking to his boss. He said Liu Yi was definitely sitting on some kind of secret, something that let his stats exceed what his level should allow. because if that wasn't true, Jack wouldn't have died to him, full stop. He urged his boss to consider the dungeon difficulty alone. A level 28 player solo clearing a level 35 dungeon built for 10 people wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. Something was off, and that something was why Jack's entire squad was gone. The boss looked at Jack with barely veiled contempt and said he was getting one more chance. He had a few days to level back up. In the meantime, the boss would deal with Liu Yi personally, sending others to handle the situation. Jack thanked him and promised he'd make it right. Back to reality now, an unknown cafe where Yun was staring at Neon like she'd just announced she was moving to the moon. Neon's entire family was apparently playing UN World. And not just casually playing, they were making serious money from it. Yun had no idea what to say to that. Neon sighed and explained that she genuinely didn't understand it either, but her parents were forcing her to grind levels with them every single day. She was exhausted. Done, she wanted out, or at the very least, she wanted to play on her own terms. Then Neon suddenly stood up and asked why Yun and her brother didn't just come play with her at her house, said it would actually be fun, especially with her brother involved. Yun blinked. She didn't even have a device to play on, that was the immediate problem. But then the gears started turning. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. If Neon and her brother ended up playing together, that was basically step one of the plan executing itself. All she had to do was find a reason to excuse herself and leave them alone. Incredibly cunning. She agreed immediately and suggested they head to replace, back to the protagonist, who was already knee-deep in the third and final wave. He was taking them apart one after another, and something felt different this time, a kind of power he had never felt before. The new gear wasn't just changing his numbers, he could actually feel it. Every movement was sharper. The weapon in his hands felt lighter than it had any right to, his footwork was faster, more instinctive. When he jumped, he cleared heights that put him well above the entire horde below. In those moments, suspended above the chaos, he felt untouchable. Then something in the swarm caught his eye, a creature that genuinely gave him pause just for a second. But his gaze didn't waver. He committed to his strongest attack, dropped down from above and wiped out an entire cluster of ants in a single strike, and it still wasn't enough for him. He wanted more power, more experience, more of everything. As the ants continued to fall around him, he wanted to reach the heights he had once only been able to look up at from below. Then, as he hung in the air above the horde, the same creature he'd noticed earlier appeared directly in front of him. A level 35 spider boss. Liu Yi didn't need a second to decide, he was ending this now. The notifications came in a cascade. Dungeon cleared, rewards incoming. Experience gained 360,000 points, then multiplied by 10. On top of that, he received the title Dungeon Defender. For every ally lost during the dungeon, the player's stats received a permanent 10% increase. His stats at level 36 were genuinely staggering. Damage, defense, resistance, strength, agility, endurance, intelligence, perception, distributable points, health, and cognitive power, all sitting at numbers that would make most players question if they were reading the screen correctly. Reaching level 30 also unlocked a skill branch choice. The first option was Silence, an active skill that reset all skill cooldowns by 5 seconds, costing 50 cognitive power points with 1 additional second added per level. The second option was Captivity, which locked an enemy in place for 10 full seconds. He sat down where he stood, completely spent but wearing a satisfied expression. He had taken down a massive boss, alone. And he had become dramatically stronger in just a few hours. Even he hadn't fully seen that coming. Scene shift: the real world, the protagonist's home back in reality. Liu Yi stepped out onto the balcony and let the outside air hit him. He let his thoughts settle, quietly taking stock of everything he had just accomplished. Proud of it. All he needed now was the right moment to get his sister into the game, to build her up to the point where she could defend herself when things went sideways. Then he heard the front door close behind him. He stepped back inside. His sister was home. She was standing in the hallway holding a gaming device. She explained that getting it hadn't been easy, but she'd had help. A friend named Nyan had come through for her. The only downside was the device had caused her some connection issues. His sister stepped further into the room and someone followed her in. Liu Yi went completely still for a few seconds. He couldn't believe it. His sister had actually gotten a device for UN World. Then it hit him and his expression completely flipped. She could play with him now, she could train, she could grow strong enough to survive. Yun was all smiles as she explained the arrangement. Since Nyan had been the one to get the device, she deserved a proper thank you. So Nyan would be staying with them. Nyan greeted Liu Yi without any hesitation. He barely registered her. His eyes were locked on the device, a real UN World Access device right there in his hands, unreal. His sister noticed immediately and was not thrilled about being invisible in her own home. He picked up the box, turning it over, already asking how they had managed to get it. Not that the method really mattered to him, the fact that he had it now was the only thing that counted. His sister grimaced. Her brother had a gorgeous girl standing right next to him who was about to move in with them, and he was interrogating a cardboard box. Unbelievable. Nyan, for her part, was genuinely fascinated. She had never seen anyone get that excited over a piece of gaming hardware. We go back one day in time now, an unknown level 40 dungeon. A vast forest under a bright moon, quiet and still. Several players were gathered around a campfire talking strategy. Clear the level 40 dungeon, overtake the second-ranked team, increase their profits. They were also talking about the remarkably talented girl who had led them to a nearby village. This girl was part of the New Order group, third-ranked team, respected across the board. Her name was Washi. Then a man named Kaang settled in beside her and suggested that after they cleared the dungeon, she should consider requesting a transfer to the first-ranked team. It would accelerate her growth considerably. Washi gave him a blank look and went right back to what she was doing. She didn't even dignify it with a response. One of the other team members stepped in and reminded the captains that if Washi left, their progress would slow down dramatically. The captains heard him out, but the conversation shifted to something harder to argue with. The team had no real future if they let her go. They had invested heavily in her development, and they needed her now more than ever. The captain took a slow breath and said it plainly: they couldn't hold someone back because of their own feelings. He believed that even after she reached the top, she wouldn't forget where she came from. She wouldn't forget them. He decided to ask her directly. Smiled and put the question to her. What he got back was just her smile. One of the team members buried his face in his hands. He couldn't bring himself to just wish her well on the next chapter. Another member agreed with the captain. Holding her back made no sense. They simply weren't strong enough to be worth her staying. One by one, the team members chimed in, all saying the same thing: if things ever got hard on the first team, she could come back. No questions asked, just like when she first joined them. They would help with whatever she needed. Warmth in the circle was genuine. Washi smiled, called them brothers, and thanked them from the heart. And since they were being so kind, she said she wanted to ask one last favor. She looked almost embarrassed saying it. The entire group fell silent, exchanging confused glances. Nobody knew what she meant. Then a blinding light tore through the clearing. Every team member dropped. No movement, no sound. The one still clinging to consciousness used a healing skill, then stared at Washi in disbelief. She had been with them the whole time, and she had just betrayed every single one of them. She wanted more power, but her level wasn't high enough to get it the conventional way. So she had triggered the dungeon's reward condition herself at the cost of her entire team. She was willing to pay that price to become the strongest player in UN World. The captain looked at her with pure fury. After everything they had given her, this was her answer. Washi just laughed, gave a dismissive wave, and told them not to be so dramatic. It was just a game. They could respawn, level up, and try again. The captain was done listening. He told her to go to hell, called her an ungrateful creature, and opened fire. Washi slipped every bullet without effort and told him calmly, like a reminder, that she had pointed this out many times before. In UN World, bullet speed had a hard cap. A player with an agility stat above 100 could outpace any projectile. Firearms simply couldn't keep up with someone moving at her level. She appeared behind him before he registered she had moved and ran cold steel through his neck. She repeated the lesson quietly. Bladed weapons were a completely different equation. Their speed and damage scaled with the user's stats uncapped. That was why she could kill him so easily. Next day, a level 45 dungeon, 20 players deep in a fight against a humanoid monster. The captain checked in. Several players were running low on potions, and he wanted to know if their supplies were holding up. The captain in question was the player known as Strikes from the New Order Guild, and watching him fight, it was easy to see why people respected him. Technically sharp, relentlessly aggressive, his one real limitation was that his power took time to build. But once he reached peak output, even the most oversized dungeon bosses had a bad time. The captain was level 45. Beside him was Blazing Fire, also from New Order, also level 45. Mid-fight, the captain's attention caught on another player nearby whose power signature matched his own. He made a note of it immediately: potential enemy or potential recruit. Blazing Fire cut in quickly and mentioned the player had taken out the Mirror Kingdom's captain. That actually made Strikes pause and reach up to scratch the back of his head. He shifted gears and asked what ways I had been up to lately. Cut to a forest somewhere outside the controlled zone. A girl stood at the edge of a cliff, scrolling through her system screen. She had received a private message from Blazing Fire. She needed to meet a new player, our protagonist, because of his power. Weizai read the message and a quiet smile crossed her face. The message didn't say kill or recruit, it left it open, but she understood what powerful players represented. They were rare and they were valuable. If she brought him into the guild, it would be a clear win for the new order's growth. If she killed him instead, she'd be actively working against that growth. The decision carried real weight. Blazing fire had left it entirely in her hands. Her value to the guild and to herself depended on making the right call. She thought it over, then decided she'd kill him. Meanwhile, back at Liu Yi's place, he sat at his desk with a blank document open in front of him and started mapping out a plan. 2 priorities: get his character and gear to level 60 and establish a fortified base in the real world before the apocalypse hit. In his past life, level 60 had been the absolute ceiling. No player had ever gone beyond it. If he could reach that cap before UN World crossed over into reality, he would be the strongest player alive. And with that kind of strength, both he and his sister would make it through. With the collapse of law and public order and the scarcity of basic resources, only the most powerful guilds would be capable of restoring any kind of stability. In that environment, food wouldn't just be currency, it would be everything. That meant stockpiling supplies and getting a secure location ready before the takeover was non-negotiable. With his current funds, he decided to rent the building next door. The rest of the money would go toward rice and canned goods. All that was left now was waiting for the supplies to arrive. In the game, he was sitting at level 36, still a long way from the cap. But as long as he kept grinding in-game and building up resources in the real world, he and his sister had a real shot at coming out the other side of this intact. When he brought his sister and Nyan into the game, he led them straight to the Armory Pavilion. He explained the core principle in UN World: strength was everything, and strength was rooted in weapon mastery. To grow as fast as possible, they needed to master multiple weapon types and awaken their true ability. His sister took to the spear, while Liu Yi turned to Nyanchu and reminded her that skill without the right foundation was worthless. They needed to work through every available weapon until they hit their full potential. For reference, Nyanchu was currently at level 32. Both of them agreed to the plan. After that, Nyanchu headed toward the exit. Watching her go, Liu Yi reflected on how much his interference had already changed things. In his past life, Nyanchu never came to their home. He was fairly certain his actions had been the reason she ended up bringing the device for Liu Yun. In the original timeline, it was because of Nyanchu that he and his sister had survived for 3 years. Now it was his turn to return that debt. That thought pushed him out of the pavilion at a jog, and for a moment he felt something uncomplicatedly good. He was getting closer. Level 60 wasn't a fantasy anymore. Half a day later, Liu Yi walked out of a level 35 dungeon as a level 37 player. One teammate was already singing his praises, said the guy had the firepower to clear a 10-person dungeon entirely by himself. Another agreed that without him, the run would have been a completely different story. Pumped up, they started pushing to run it again immediately. Liu Yi turned them down. He had somewhere else to be. The team looked genuinely disappointed, but insisted he add them and promised they'd hit him up next time. He smiled, scratched the back of his neck, and agreed. But the moment he stepped back into the party-finding room and the team was out of earshot, his expression shifted. He ran the numbers quietly to himself. Half a day, sometimes a full day per level 35 dungeon run. That was roughly half a level per run. At that pace, he'd reach level 50 in the 20 days remaining before the real-world takeover. Level 60 was mathematically out of reach. He sat down alone in the empty hall and let his mind go back to the first dungeon he had ever cleared, the one that had earned him the title of Dungeon Protector. And sitting there, he arrived at the only conclusion that actually worked. Sacrifice 9 teammates to maximize the solo reward and compress the experience gain. In his past life, he knew exactly what players who ran dungeons like that were called slaughterhouses, and the people who used that method were called gutter rats. If he went down this road, he would become one of them. But if it was the only way, his thought broke off. A notification sound cut through the silence. A system window opened. New message. He opened it. A dungeon invitation, a level 40 expedition, 10-player party. He read the name attached to the invite and went still. Then the surprise shifted into something warmer. He stood up and said out loud this was the girl who, in his past life, became the single strongest fighter in the entire game. He turned it over in his mind. Why would she reach out to him now if he accepted it was a direct line to rapid leveling, the kind of opportunity that didn't come around twice? A quiet smile settled on his face, but she was New Order. In his past life, he had never crossed paths with her under circumstances like these, which meant this invitation almost certainly came with something attached. His legs tensed for just a moment, but his eyes didn't waver. The dungeon was the path forward. Decision made, he accepted. The party list populated before him. Player levels ran from 37 to 45. He scanned the names and stopped when he spotted one. Lin Fei. Liu Yi smiled. He remembered this player from his past life. Lin Fei had cleared a dungeon alone by eliminating every one of his teammates when things turned desperate, and his old crew had absolutely roasted him for it in the general chat afterward. The girl with the nickname Cookie had a similar story, though her version involved the other players coming after her first. She'd killed them all in self-defense, which didn't stop the backlash. Every name on this list had a history like that. Ways I had built this party deliberately. Liu Yi touched his chin. He couldn't quite figure out how she had known which players to pick. After joining the group chat, he announced that since everyone was assembled, they should move out. Ways I dropped a map marker for the rendezvous point. Lin Fei, noticing the new face, questioned Wei Zai's decision, said this didn't look like the player she'd been talking about, and asked why his level was still sitting at 37. Wei Zai's response was simple. On this team, level wasn't the metric. Strength was. Li pulled up the map and noted that most of the team was already in Muksu City, with the others in or heading toward the out-of-control zone. His expression went serious as he processed the layout. The out-of-control zone was not somewhere you wandered into casually. Muksu City's controlled territories were split into 5 distinct zones. Muksu City itself served as the central resupply hub for all players. The dungeons within the city limits were fully controlled and had been modified over time, offering options from beginner-level challenges all the way up to serious content. The especially dangerous zone was designed for players looking to push themselves. The controlled danger zone was even more heavily modified, all its creatures kept sealed within the city boundaries. Liu Yi had already run one of these with a previous team. The chaos zone was a different story. Muksu's influence over the dungeons there was thin at best. Creatures above level 30 moved freely outside the dungeon boundaries. The out-of-control zone was worse still. Players who wandered in without preparation died almost immediately. Creatures above level 70 roamed without restriction. And then the destruction zone. Muksu City had zero authority there. The dungeon creatures couldn't be contained, max-level monsters capable of leveling everything they touched. By the time Liu Yi finished his analysis, he was already in the out-of-control zone, closing in on the meeting point. He was cutting through the forest at a hard pace when a scream rang out. He stopped and turned, trying to pinpoint the source. Then the forest ahead of him shifted. Creatures made of branches and leaves materialized in the clearing. He dropped behind a nearby rock immediately and watched as the creatures swept toward a stream, trailing vines as they moved. They weren't individually threatening, but their numbers were the problem. One sound was all it would take to chain-pull them in successive waves. Someone had been careless enough to make noise. That scream had been the price. After a few moments, the forest went quiet again. Liu Yi peeked out. The creatures had moved on. He wondered briefly if whoever had screamed had made it out. He didn't wait to find out. He broke from cover and pushed toward the meeting point. Then something registered in his peripheral vision, fast movement coming straight for him. A spearhead flying directly at his face. He reacted on pure instinct, caught the weapon midair and dropped his body back to let the momentum pass over him. The attacker closed the distance immediately, and Liu Yi worked to identify who he was dealing with. Whoever it was had a solid grip on the spear, and drove it at him again. Liu Yi slipped the attack cleanly. Now he had a clear look at his opponent's face, burning with excitement. This person was enjoying this. Liu Yi drew his katana and countered. The attacker seized the spearhead with both hands, catching the blade dead on, and grinned. The collision sent a shockwave rippling out, scattering dust and leaves in every direction. When the noise faded, they stood facing each other, reading the other's stance. It was Lin Fei, the same player from the party list. He looked satisfied, like the exchange had confirmed exactly what he needed to know about why Wei Zai had chosen Liu Yi. Liu Yi held his stance a moment longer. Lin Fei smiled and acknowledged it. Liu Yi was clearly on another level, but at least now he'd earned something from the exchange, respect. Before walking away, he pointed out that they needed to reach the meeting point quickly or the monster density in the area would box them in. Then he left, no fanfare. Liu Yi lowered his katana and watched him go. He registered it immediately. This player had genuine power. And if Lin Fei was this capable, then Wei Zai was almost certainly operating on an entirely different level. This was a strong team. Whether anyone here would be desperate enough to claim the solo completion reward was still an open question. But the probability of someone dying in this dungeon was not low. He reached the meeting point a while later. The others were already there. He approached the portal and paused. A girl was sitting on a nearby rock, and when she saw him, she smiled. She stood up, clapped once to pull the group's focus, and said she wanted to say something before they went in. Liu Yi looked over his teammates, quietly acknowledging that he was part of this group now, even if he wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet. Wei Zai spoke clearly. The dungeons in the uncontrolled zone didn't follow the same rules as everywhere else. Because of that, the first thing they needed to do upon entering was read the dungeon's conditions, no matter how strange they turned out to be. Panic was off the table. Rational discussion and a calm plan were what would get them through. The group took it in and agreed. Weizai gave a small nod of approval, then turned toward the portal and told everyone to move. As the others filed forward, Liu Yi held back for just a moment. He let his earlier doubts surface one more time, acknowledged them. Ever since he had laid eyes on Weizai, the person his past life had confirmed as the game's strongest player, something in him had started to waver. He wasn't sure if it was insecurity, nerves, or just the raw fear of measuring himself against someone who might genuinely be out of his reach. He also feared wasting everything he had built, putting in all this work and still falling short. But instead of letting any of it take root, he looked up at the moon hanging over the forest, took a slow breath, and walked forward. There was only one way to find out. The moment they crossed the portal, a cutscene began to play. A doll's voice filled the space, lamenting that her companion no longer wanted to play with her. Slumped against the wall, unconscious, was the woman who had once been her playmate. The doll's tone carried no emotion as she concluded if this one wouldn't play anymore, she would simply find a new toy. The hallway that followed was lined with bodies. Standing amid the carnage was a small, blood-stained mechanical puppet. It sighed and said its old companion had been the most fun. Now with nobody left, it supposed it was time to go home. Then its head dipped slightly and it murmured no, that wasn't possible anymore. The cutscene ended. The players found themselves standing at the top of a circular tower. At the center, on a pedestal, sat the same blood-stained doll from the scene. Carved into the base of the structure were the words, "Hope and despair coexist." The team was still processing what they had just watched when one of the players broke the silence and asked what kind of dungeon they had just walked into. Another player immediately agreed. Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. They stepped away from the portal and one of them remarked that this was exactly what made the meta world so unsettling and fascinating all at once. The dungeons were completely unpredictable, every map and challenge unique. Another added that the most disturbing part was knowing that some dungeons simply couldn't be cleared without someone dying in the process. They studied the pedestal. The doll was the only thing in the room, which made it the obvious focal point, likely the key to understanding what this place wanted from them. But before anyone could act on that theory, the figure vanished, and immediately the system pushed a notification to every player. The dungeon entrance had been sealed. The only way out was to complete the mission, Puppet's Tricks. The objective was to destroy the doll. A puppet would appear in one team member's backpack and everyone else's job was to eliminate the puppet's owner. The dungeon would be cleared only if the player holding the puppet survived for up to 6 hours. If time ran out, the mission failed. There was one additional rule: the puppet's owner could transfer it to another player, but only by killing one of their own allies first. Liu Yi read through the mission description slowly, turning it over in his mind. This dungeon had clearly been designed for players who wanted the desperate situation reward. The mission stated plainly, if the puppet ended up with the last survivor, that player had a 100% chance of claiming the grand prize. The system announced that the puppet had been assigned and the countdown had begun. Liu Yi's first instinct was to open his backpack and confirm he didn't have it. He pulled up the system window, then stopped himself. Now wasn't the right moment. Once the group settled down, he'd check, and if he did have the puppet, he'd need to decide whether to hand himself over, which would immediately paint a target on his back. Going up against two powerhouses at once wasn't a position he wanted to be in. His odds of surviving dropped dramatically the moment the group knew. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Players started eyeing each other sideways, suspicion rising by the second. Liu Yi noted it. Everyone was on edge, either hiding something or in exactly the same position as him. Then Weizai clapped her hands and pulled everyone's attention to her. Liu Yi shifted his focus to her. She smiled and laid out a proposal. Since everyone knew the objective, whoever had the puppet should just step forward and accept the outcome. In exchange, the rest of the team would split the reward fairly among everyone. She asked if the players who didn't have the puppet agreed to those terms. Most of the group nodded along. Liu Yi used the distraction to his advantage. While all eyes were on Weizai, he quietly opened his system window and scrolled through his inventory. He checked each slot carefully. His eyes stopped. The puppet was in his backpack. He had just joined this team, and they had already handed him a gift, just not the kind anyone wanted. He looked through his inventory one more time, just to be sure. Then he glanced at the others. His priority was clear: eliminate one team member, pass the puppet along, and remove the immediate threat hanging over his head. He needed to get rid of it. The question was who to target first. Even if he managed to transfer the puppet, facing two high-level players who weren't going to show an ounce of mercy was a problem that didn't go away. Without waiting for more discussion, one of the players asked if anyone wanted to come clean. Liu Yi kept quiet, eyes lowered. Then the team captain moved and came straight at him. She stopped directly in front of him wearing a confident smile and told Liu Yi it was time to admit he had the puppet. Liu Yi didn't flinch outwardly, but the accusation caught him off guard. He kept his expression neutral and said nothing. Then one of the female players called him by name, accused him of always needing to stand out and demanded he speak up. Liu Yi stayed exactly as he was, silent. He let his eyes drift across the rest of the team. Every single one of them had the same look, that subtle, knowing smile. The glances they'd been exchanging clicked into place. They had confirmed it without saying a word to each other. Somehow, without any direct accusation or visible tells, they had figured out he was the one holding the puppet. They were all working together. The full picture landed at once. The sudden invitation to a team this strong, the carefully constructed setup inside the dungeon. And now this, it had all been engineered to get rid of him. The sheer number of players assembled here only made that more obvious. He still didn't fully understand Wei Zai's personal hostility toward him, but the dungeon's purpose was clear enough. He looked at the female player directly, ran the calculation, and reached his conclusion. By inviting him here to clear this dungeon, she had effectively signed her own death warrant. Whatever reward came out of this desperate situation was going to be his. His smile widened as the full shape of the game they were trying to run on him became clear. The woman remarked that he was rude, though it didn't seem to bother her. She acknowledged Liu Yi had shown some strength, but as far as she was concerned, he was nowhere near the level of anyone else on this team. There was no point dragging this out. The faster they ended it, the faster they could move on to their next session. Faced with that logic, Liu Yi simply agreed. Then Lin Fei spoke up, offered him a chance to defend himself first, said it would make the fight more interesting. After all, the goal was to break him down piece by piece, not finish it in one move. Wei Zai covered her face with both hands and sighed at how brutal they were being. Then she dropped her hands and there was that sharp, cunning smile. She looked directly at Liu Yi and told him he shouldn't force them to take this any further. Without hesitation, Liu Yi swapped out his weapon for the pendulum pistol and leveled it at her. His finger didn't pull the trigger. Wei Zai read the hesitation immediately and concluded he was choosing not to act rashly. What she hadn't realized yet was that he was also choosing not to waste this shot. The other team members took one look at the weapon he was holding and started talking over each other with contempt. They should have been more careful, someone muttered. A player who shot without thinking stood no chance against opponents like them. Lin Fei smiled and offered a different read. If they had been warned about Liu Yi ahead of time, it was because he had something special. Maybe his shots carried a trapping effect, something that could lock an enemy in place. The others laughed it off, pointing out that magic prisons were a well-known trick in this world. One of them suggested they take it seriously anyway. In the meta world, traps were real, and the specific technique they were describing was known as a cage. Wei Zai laughed along with them, clearly enjoying every second of this. Liu Yi smiled and activated his captivity ability. Wei Zai's smile vanished. She threw herself backward, landing several meters away. She looked herself over, confirmed she was still unharmed, and tried to compose herself, but the flicker of nerves was there. She called out to Lin Fei, voice low and sharp. She told him not to underestimate Liu Yi. The safe play was to hit him together and end this before it got complicated. Liu Yi, for his part, kept smiling. Lin Fei was already locked inside the cage, chains holding firm regardless of how hard he struggled against them. The rest of the team erupted, shock ripping through the group as they processed what they were seeing. Even Wei Zai stared at her trapped teammate, her disbelief completely unguarded. That was Liu Yi's opening. He activated his special pistol ability, Lockup. The technique gave him a choice: triple the damage of his next attack or stun the target. He chose damage. The system confirmed 100 knowledge points consumed. Next attack, 5,000 damage. Ice sharp and locked in, he raised the pendulum pistol, aimed directly at Lin Fei, and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the air in a straight line toward the immobilized player. It punched clean through Lin Fei's body and blew a massive hole through his torso. His health dropped to 0. He hit the ground. The system confirmed Liu Yi had eliminated Lin Fei and the doll had been successfully transferred to another player. The moment a team member died, the Dungeon Defender title activated, boosting all of Liu Yi's stats by 10%. On top of that, he received a pearl as a reward for the kill. The rest of the team stood frozen, eyes locked on their fallen teammate, none of them willing to accept what had just happened. Liu Yi, meanwhile, was already running the threat assessment. There were 2 scenarios that could actually get him killed. The first was a simultaneous assault from both Wei Zai and whoever else was strong enough to challenge him. The second, and the one that worried him more, was the possibility of a 4th player with unknown abilities hiding somewhere in the mix. Working through what he knew, he concluded that only Wei Zai and Lin Fei had the individual strength to genuinely threaten him. With Lin Fei gone, the real danger was now concentrated in one place. The team had made the mistake of underestimating him. They'd been overconfident and it had already cost them. By taking out Lin Fei, he had shattered the most dangerous combination on the field. Now he just needed to systematically work through the rest. A quiet smile crossed his face. He could see the path to victory from here. The ideal play would have been to go for Wei Zai first, but she had slipped the shot at the last second. Her perception stat was simply too high, giving her an edge that made her extraordinarily difficult to catch off guard in fast-paced exchanges. Liu Yi issued a direct warning to the team. The doll had passed to one of them. If they wanted to protect their ally, they needed to move now. Otherwise, he would destroy the doll and eliminate any chance of revenge. He was aware the team had been weakened, but getting careless now would be a mistake. His next priority was identifying who had the doll and making sure it stayed in their inventory until the clock ran out. The team captain heard that and cursed sharply, then froze. The danger was immediate. She spun toward the group and ordered everyone to hold their positions. She knew exactly what Liu Yi was doing. The other players, visibly panicking, tightened their formation around one of their own, trying to use their bodies as a screen. The player in the center flinched and instinctively took a step back. That was all Liu Yi needed. He had his target. The terrified expression confirmed it. She was completely surrounded by her own teammates, which meant she was exactly where he needed her to be. Without wasting a second, he launched himself forward and activated his skill, boosting all stats by 200%. He drove straight toward the center of their formation, committed to cutting through anyone who stepped in his way. Katana drawn, he moved through them. Their resistance barely registered. The system logged 6 opponents defeated, stats increased by 70%. Several of his attributes broke past the 1,000-point threshold. As rewards for the eliminations, pearls, equipment, and items dropped into his inventory. Wei Zai had seen enough. She charged forward with her dagger, fury written across her face, going straight for him. Liu Yi caught the attack cleanly, redirecting it with a precise counter of his own weapon. Nearby, the player nicknamed Cookie had completely shut down, trembling, collapsed on the ground, unable to move. Wei Zai clocked it immediately. She called it out. Cookie was still alive and still had the doll. That meant Liu Yi was going for the dungeon's completion reward. She looked almost impressed despite herself. Liu Yi answered with a smile. Her boots lit up as she activated her arcane leap. She shifted sideways in an instant, warning him that targeting her had been a mistake. She began circling at a speed that was barely trackable. Liu Yi stayed sharp, and then she simply wasn't in front of him anymore. Before he could locate her, Wei Zai materialized behind him, already mid-strike. He anticipated the angle and twisted, swinging his katana back toward her. She was already gone, reappearing behind him again, landing a solid punch before he could reset. She gave him no recovery window, stringing attacks together in rapid succession and carving Liu Yi's health down dramatically. He activated his recovery ability and watched the health bar refill. Then he raised his blade and turned toward her. Wei Zai's eyes narrowed. She called out the number 9,000 damage, roughly 75% of his total health in a single exchange. She was facing something she genuinely hadn't prepared for. Their blades connected with a resonant clash. She said it with confidence. At this rate, he would exhaust his healing supply before she exhausted her stamina. Victory was hers by attrition. Liu Yi just smiled. Wei Zai switched weapons without warning and drove in with a sudden, devastating strike, 9,800 damage. And just like every time before it, Liu Yi's health was back to full in the same instant. Wei Zai stopped moving. She stared. She knew the math. A level 30 instant recovery potion restored 1,000 health points, and players could only carry 10 vials into a dungeon. But Liu Yi had now regenerated over 19,000 points total. The numbers didn't add up. She was still trying to work it out when Liu Yi moved. He shot forward and hit her with a direct, heavy punch. Then he smiled and told her casually, almost apologetically, that he was the only one walking out of this dungeon. Wei Zai gritted her teeth, slipping his follow-up attack at the exact moment it came. He tracked her movement with a look that wasn't quite frustration but close, and watched her fall back to reposition herself beside Cookie. She studied him from there and arrived at a conclusion. With a health pool that enormous, he had to be running support skills. Liu Yi smiled at the deduction and gave her something back in return, pointing out that Wei Zai had clearly dumped everything into dexterity on top of her strength and close combat investment. Her speed was operating at an abnormal level and her attacks were almost guaranteed to land as critical hits. Her expression shifted for just a moment. Then the composure came back, wearing a forced smile. She admitted it. Because of those choices, her cognition power was near empty. She had burned through it. She was running on fumes. She reflected quietly that her options had narrowed significantly. Maybe the cleanest play left was to kill Cookie herself and close this out. Liu Yi felt his focus sharpen. He realized he had pushed her into a corner, and a cornered Wei Zai considering extreme options was dangerous in a completely different way. She was fast enough to reach Cookie hundreds of times before he could intervene. So why hadn't she moved yet? The hesitation didn't track with everything else she'd shown him. Something was off. He asked her directly what was she waiting for. As long as Cookie was still breathing, this wasn't over. Then the system notified him the stat enhancement had completed its full cycle. The pendulum pistol and captivity skill had both recharged. His eyes went wide. He raised his weapon and pointed it at Wei Zai, ready to trigger the skill. Then his entire body locked up. He couldn't move. Confusion flooded in what was happening. Before he could process it, Cookie had crossed the distance and delivered a killing blow to the team captain. Wei Zai looked at Liu Yi with a calm, satisfied smile. The answer came in the seconds that followed. Just before it happened, Wei Zai had privately instructed Cookie kill her, then take his own life. That way, Liu Yi couldn't claim the victory. In exchange, she had promised Cookie double the reward for following through, and he had. Cookie struck her down, then turned the blade on himself. Both bodies began to dissolve. Liu Yi stood completely still. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Wei Zai laughed one last time before she disappeared entirely, calling him a loser and making sure he heard it clearly. He had lost. When the last trace of them was gone, Liu Yi was alone in the dungeon. He took a step back, still trying to make sense of it. Then his legs gave out and he dropped to the floor. His mind was spinning. How had this happened? Why? He opened his inventory. The doll had returned to him. That realization hit like a physical weight. The fight had been completely nullified. He kept turning it over. Why would Wei Zai do something like that? Was the entire point just to deny him the win? To him, that was almost absurd. Why throw away your own survival just to spite someone? He grabbed his own head, trying to think through it. Both of them were dead. The doll was back in his hands. If Wei Zai hadn't gone through with it and he had managed to finish her off, the doll would have completed its journey in his inventory cleanly. Now, with no other players left alive, all he could do was wait for his own death to catch up with him. The win had been right there, and it had slipped away this easily. A desperate scream tore out of him and echoed through the empty dungeon. After a while, his breathing started to level out. He lay on the floor and focused on just pulling in steady breaths. Staring up at the ceiling, he muttered to himself that there had to be another way. If every ally was dead, UN World wouldn't just let him sit here and rot. That wasn't how the system was built. That meant there was another method somewhere. Path he hadn't found yet. He pushed himself back to his feet and started actually looking at everything around him. He decided to sweep the entire room, determined to find whatever he was missing. When he reached the edge of the platform and extended his hand, his fingers made contact with something solid but invisible. A transparent wall. The entire platform was contained. He worked it out quickly. The dungeon's active territory was limited to the boundaries of this cylindrical platform. Nothing beyond it was accessible. After a thorough sweep of the area, he made his way back to the central pedestal. Doll in hand, he climbed up onto it and stood still, examining every surface and angle with fresh eyes. Then something caught his attention, a plaque with an inscription carved into it. Hope and despair exist together. He leaned closer and noticed something else, a faint scratched marking just below the main text. He moved in and squinted. Something was written there in very small letters. He ran his fingers along the stone surface and slowly traced the words. I can't open the door. The moment his fingers pressed against the inscription, the slab shifted slightly under his hand. A mechanical sound echoed through the chamber, something engaging deep in the structure. The system immediately notified him. He had found the entrance to the Cutscene Research Institute. New information populated before him. To open the membrane, 1,000 cognition points were required. Liu Yi's expression fell. That was a significant cost. His energy had already taken hits from the extended battle, and even with stats exceeding 1,500, the fight had left him sitting just above 1,000 cognition points. Scraping together more inside this environment wasn't going to be easy. He ran the calculation. By spending 700 points to boost all his skills by 350, he could push his cognition past the 1,000 threshold needed to open the membrane and still hold a buffer of over 300 points in reserve. Going into unknown territory at anything less than full combat readiness was a risk he wasn't willing to take. He confirmed the choice. The system processed it. All skills increased by 350 points, 700 cognition points consumed. The remaining 1,000 points were spent to activate the membrane, and the pedestal transformed, shifting, reconfiguring, becoming a door. A sharp gust of wind rushed against his face. Then a male voice called his name. The tone was urgent, pressing. It told him he needed to make a decision immediately. Two options: display what follows you or dissolve and map everything. Liu Yi blinked, trying to parse what he'd just heard. The voice pushed again. The choice had to be made now for his computing power to activate. He didn't have a clear read on what either option actually meant, and choosing wrong without understanding the consequences was something he couldn't afford. He tried to build a framework around it. If this was a fixed system test, it was probably connected to a significant event, something on the scale of a major catastrophe. The recurring element was computing power. He turned it over. Did displaying that power mean guaranteeing his own survival, or was it simply a tool that could be leveraged to escape whatever disaster was coming? He reached back into his past life for anything relevant, but he had never gotten this far before. This scenario was completely new territory. If the core goal was keeping himself and his sister alive, the logical play was to display what follows him. But if the only way to sidestep the disaster was through an external resource, then the safer bet was to dissolve and map everything. And if the disaster couldn't be avoided regardless, the only real option was to go in prepared to handle whatever came out the other side. He also turned over the possibility that mapping the computing power was connected to identifying specific individuals, people with certain qualities or traits. But how could he be sure he was reading that correctly? After working through everything, he landed on one conclusion. The Forgotten Ones needed access to the most complete form of computing power available. Only a select few could return to the characteristic of imagination. If the first world had never emerged, player levels would never have evolved to where they stood now. Convinced this was the right call, Liu Yi chose to dissolve and map everything. The moment he confirmed it, sparks flickered before his eyes. He held his breath and waited. When the light cleared, he was in the exact same spot. He didn't move for a few seconds. Then he frowned and looked around. Nothing had changed. The conclusion was unavoidable. He had chosen wrong. Liu Yi sat down, crossed his arms, and reasoned it through. The correct answer was probably to focus on revealing who was following him. He still had 350 cognition points remaining. The puppet was acting like a parasite, keeping him in a constant low-level state of combat, which made recovery agonizingly slow. But with 5 hours still on the clock, accumulating 1,000 points and getting 2 more attempts was achievable. He just had to wait. He closed his eyes and settled in. An hour and a half later, the system confirmed he had accumulated 700 cognition points. His eyes opened. He pushed his recovery rate, built up to 1,000 points, and activated the membrane again. The same two options appeared: focus on displaying who is following you or dissolve and map everything. Liu Yi moved toward the first option, then stopped. Something wasn't sitting right. If this was purely about picking the correct option, why couldn't he just enter the research institute once he got it right? If the door was designed to block the puppet's path, the puppet would never be able to enter the institute it considered home. So why was the door still here? What was it actually testing? Knowledge, a specific trait, or something else entirely? The available context pointed to one thing: the puppet had left the institute out of stubbornness and wanted to return, but the door was refusing it. Maybe the answer wasn't about which option was correct. Maybe it was about the attitude behind the choice. Liu Yi held on that possibility, turning it over carefully. He worked through it from every angle he could think of, and then chose the second option again. He was back on the platform. Unchanged, same as before, one attempt left before he'd have to sit and wait again. He still believed in his read on this. That hadn't wavered. He sat back down and waited. An hour and a half later, with only 27 minutes remaining before the mission ended, he checked his cognition. 700 points accumulated. Liu Yi opened his eyes, spent his remaining points, and activated the membrane one final time. This time, upon selecting the second option again, he immediately stepped back and felt the ground tremble beneath him. He leaped away and watched the pedestal begin to descend into the floor. A genuine, relieved grin broke across his face as he shouted he had done it. Looking back on it, he realized the real challenge had never been about picking the right answer. It was about the conviction to pick the same answer 3 times in a row. The door would only open if you committed to your choice and didn't fold. A staircase materialized, leading downward. He looked at the entrance to the research institute and understood this secret level had been designed for a full team. Every mechanic pointed toward it. And yet here he was, walking down those steps alone. Nobody had ever cleared it this way. To pull it off, he'd had to boost every skill, operate on pure instinct and logic, and trigger a special counter mechanism. Without those upgrades, opening the door 3 consecutive times would have been impossible. Right now, this hidden level was completely inaccessible to any other player in the game. Liu Yi knew he had been careful throughout all of this, but desperation had still pushed him toward risks he wouldn't have taken otherwise. Being bold was necessary, being reckless was something else. If he had known going in just how fractured his team actually was, he would never have made the choices that led to so many unnecessary deaths. The hallway at the bottom was long, empty, and well lit. At the far end sat a single door. In front of it lay a body, bloody, motionless. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman. Then a bright sphere materialized in front of him. He looked down at his own chest and watched the sphere detach from him and float away. It drifted over to the corpse and merged with the body. The system announced the evil doll had been purified. As a reward, Liu Yi received 1% of the membrane's computing power. He exhaled slowly. Then the system announced that the desperate situation achievement had been unlocked, triggering a cascade of rewards. System configuration adjustments began processing. The emotion hit him all at once. Liu Yi felt his legs lose their steadiness and leaned back against the wall. He stored his weapon. His legs were shaking and he smiled because he had just realized something. He was genuinely afraid of dying, deeply, honestly afraid. He pressed his hand over his face, embarrassed by his own reaction. The system completed its configuration and reported the results. 22,164 experience earned, 400 coins received. His level jumped to 44. HP climbed to 3,720 and knowledge power reached 846. Combat power 898, 2 new skills unlocked. The first status lock freezes the target's health bar and prevents them from spending knowledge power. Every 10 levels adds 1 second to the freeze duration. Applicable to the target for up to 10 minutes at a cost of 50 cognition points, with duration increasing by 10 seconds every 10 levels. Liu Yi clenched both fists. He still couldn't fully accept what he had just pulled off. He had thought he was just beating Wei Zai, but what he had actually overcome was something much bigger than that. He jumped, let out a laugh that echoed off the walls, and the dungeon began to fade around him. Meanwhile, his sister and Nyanchu had already worked through their weapon training and reached full mastery. They looked at each other, satisfied with the result. Wei Zai, on the other hand, was at the player resurrection point, waiting. 6 hours had passed since Liu Yi had entered that dungeon. He still hadn't come out. She stood with her arms crossed, a frown deepening on her face. Where exactly was he? Then Blazing Fire sent a message asking what had happened. Wei Zai replied in a single sentence there had been a death. Blazing Fire asked if Liu Yi was responsible. Wei Zai corrected him, she had been the one who died. A brief silence followed on his end. Then he asked what information she had managed to gather and what his next move should be. Wei Zai told him to set up a mirror realm battle for her. A single mirror copy session would be enough to restore her level. Blazing Fire agreed. She then confirmed what he needed to know. Liu Yi was the person they had been looking for, and he carried a special support ability. Blazing Fire was in the New Order Guild's meeting room, staring at Wei Zai's message with a tight expression. The man sitting across from him spoke up. He understood how rare support power actually was and offered to help in the uncontrolled zone. His nickname was Ouija, level 45. He fought with his fists instead of weapons, and he too possessed support power. He was willing to help, but he had a price. 10,000 coins. The guild leader leaned back with a sly grin and said that was no problem at all. Ouija left the New Order's headquarters shortly after, and found his friend already waiting outside. The friend looked like he'd been about to explode with excitement, asked immediately how it went, said their whole group had been on edge trying to track down whoever held the support power. Ouija didn't share the energy. He walked past the friend and kicked a nearby post hard enough to make a sound, which made his friend flinch back. After a moment, he said flatly that he had arranged everything. His friend blinked and said that was the first step of the plan, so why did he look like he wanted to break something? Ouija crouched down and snapped back. He was furious because he wasn't the only player in this world with support power anymore. That changed everything. Their entire plan to climb to the top of the New Order was going to need serious rethinking. Meanwhile, Liu Yi was back in his room, sitting at his desk with a piece of paper in front of him covered in notes. He was working through the concept of hash power permission, essentially the authority to control the computing output of a specific large-scale machine. He was trying to determine whether the reward from clearing the special dungeon was just the beginning of a longer quest chain, or whether it carried a deeper meaning he hadn't unpacked yet. He kept circling back to two questions: what would happen when hash power reached 100%, and what exactly was the relationship between that permission and the test he had just passed? He rubbed the tip of his nose, feeling the exhaustion settle in. But his mind wouldn't let it go. His future and his sister's depended on understanding this. He decided to get up and give his brain a break. A shower, some air, then back to the game. The moment he stepped out of his room into the hallway, Nyanchu was just coming out of the bathroom, toweling off her hair. She noticed him and gave a small wave. He returned it with a smile and headed for the bathroom, but before he went in, he glanced back. He noticed, as he always seemed to lately, that there was a pleasant scent in the air whenever she was home. He felt warmth creep into his face and scratched his cheek, mildly horrified at himself. Then he slapped both hands against his own face and told himself to get it together. He had goals. He had a timeline. He needed to get back in the game and map out the next phase immediately. Some time later, he was back in the game and making his way to the equipment crafting and sales pavilion. Standing at the terminal, he laid out his situation clearly. He was level 44. He needed 16 more levels to hit the cap at 60. At the current rate, completing a special dungeon 32 times would get him there, but each run took roughly half a day, sometimes a full one. That put his timeline at around 20 days. There were only 22 days left before UN World became reality. The margin was razor thin, and on top of the leveling problem, his equipment still had gaps that needed filling. There were two paths to acquiring gear: spend coins directly or upgrade from lower-tier equipment. He currently had 11,021 coins. Of that total, 6,750 had come from special dungeon rewards and the rest from dismantling gear he no longer used. The system offered to craft 40 purple items at 650 coins each and upgrade them from level 30 to 40 for an additional 400 coins per piece. He was still missing 3 slots: a headpiece, a necklace, and an emblem. Combining 9 existing pieces with the remaining 40 would cost him 5,550 coins total. The system estimated 100 seconds to complete the purple equipment upgrade cycle. Liu Yi ran the full math. Reaching level 60 would require approximately 16,129 coins. That meant over 40 additional dungeon runs beyond his current plan. He crossed his arms and sat with that number. If he wanted to hit his goal, playing it safe wasn't going to cut it. He would need to go after extra rewards and accept the risks that came with it. The question was who to target. Then a new message notification appeared. He paused before opening it. A quiet unease settled over him. Messages like this didn't tend to arrive without a reason. He told the system to open it. It was a private message from the guild leader of the new order. The message was brief, asking if he was available and whether they could talk. That caught him off guard. In his past life, he had been on the receiving end of something very different from this guild. He remembered being told that trash like him had no place in the new order. After the guild established dominance over the middle world, they had claimed the entire southern region and become the most powerful organization in the game. Their whole structure was built around managing elites. If someone had talent or special abilities, their survival was tied directly to the new order's approval. Everyone else, the ordinary players, the low levels without special gifts, were treated as expendable, oppressed at every turn. As someone who had died in his previous life under their shadow, Liu Yi had more than enough reason to despise them. He stared at the message with a frown, reminding himself how powerless he had been back then. He read through what Blazing Fire had written. He was putting together a team specifically for the uncontrolled zone but was short on players. He had heard Liu Yi had support power and was extending an invitation. If Liu Yi had conditions, he was welcome to state them and they could work something out. Liu Yi asked directly, was a support player the only thing they were missing? Blazing Fire confirmed it. Liu Yi felt his nerves tighten slightly. Blazing Fire followed up, this was, in his words, the strongest team currently active in this world. Liu Yi pushed back, why go to the uncontrolled zone specifically? Blazing Fire said he had his reasons. Liu Yi told him he'd think about it and respond later. Then he sat with the question, should he actually agree to this? The team that had nearly shut him out of his desperate situation reward had also handed him a way to accumulate experience and coins at several times the normal rate, so the upside was real. But the uncontrolled zone wasn't somewhere you wandered into casually. The market's transfer gate couldn't even take you directly to the secret territory, and creatures above level 70 roamed freely out there. He decided to set the decision aside for now. Equipment first. The system confirmed 650 coins to craft the purple equipment set. The upgrade completed, every stat across his equipment improved. Attack power climbed to 9,900, defense hit 716, intelligence reached 678. The remaining stats ranged between 134 and 2,011. His health jumped to 6,030 and cognitive power rose to 2,034. His current combat power registered at 102. Having crossed the 100-point threshold, he was now classified as a Supreme Space Hunter. The attribute level scaling shifted from +1 to +2, and the immediate impact was significant. Attack power surged to 11,400, defense to 892, resistance to 159, health to 8,040, and knowledge power to 2,012. Liu Yi looked at his upgraded stats and felt genuinely good about what he was seeing. Breaking past 100 combat strength had triggered the mark, amplifying his overall power by 30%. The system was rewarding the grind. He started wondering if he kept pushing his combat effectiveness. What were the thresholds? 200, 1,000, how high did the scaling actually go? Then something else crossed his mind and his expression shifted. The combat force system was accessible to any player who had the power to activate it. Which meant he wasn't the only one sitting on this advantage. The team the New Order's president was assembling, every member of that group potentially had access to the same scaling. A group like that operating with those kinds of multipliers would make pushing into the uncontrolled zone far more viable than it looked on paper. Liu Yi sent his reply to Blazing Fire he was in. The response came back almost immediately, confirming that the decision was a sound one. He was also informed that the team already had another player with support power, which significantly reduced the risk exposure for everyone. On top of that, Blazing Fire mentioned Liu Yi would receive a 100 coin reward up front. That surprised him, he hadn't asked for anything. The generosity was either a sign that the guild leader had money to burn, or that there was something attached to it that he wasn't seeing yet. Either way, it meant he'd at least have enough to keep himself fed while he figured it out. He passed the confirmation along, and the New Order's president replied without hesitation, "No issues." Liu Yi noted it quietly. He was now officially part of the team. A formal invitation came through and was accepted without any pushback. A message went out in the group chat introducing the new member and prompting the others to welcome him. Weijia responded with immediate curiosity, asked if Liu Yi would be the second support player alongside himself. After a brief exchange of greetings, the president scheduled a meetup at the North Gate. Before heading out, Liu Yi picked up a knife and thought through his approach. He decided to keep his headgear off and carry a common weapon for appearances. If something unexpected happened, he needed a fallback that didn't telegraph his real capabilities. Keeping the knife hidden made sense too. In an unfamiliar environment with unknown intentions, every layer of preparation mattered. When he arrived at the North Gate, he pulled up the team's member list and scanned through it. Nearly everyone was level 50, with the two support players being the notable exceptions. He moved a little further forward and spotted a crowd gathered nearby. Blazing Fire was among them, arms crossed, expression carrying a thinly veiled look of disapproval at something. The other players were clearly curious, watching closely as the new additions arrived. We just spotted him first. He leaned forward and waved with obvious enthusiasm. Liu Yi walked over, gave a brief introduction, and got a smile in return. Blazing Fire broke the quiet, remarking that he had never personally encountered holders of support power before, and now he had two standing right in front of him. Before they moved out toward the uncontrolled zone, he told them there was something he wanted everyone to see first. Liu Yi studied him carefully. The more he watched, the more convinced he became this was the New Order's president. If that was true, he was standing in front of one of the most powerful individuals in the entire game. The president made his expectation clear. Before they departed, both new members needed to demonstrate their abilities. Two support players exchanged a glance. Weijia volunteered to go first and stepped forward. Liu Yi scratched the back of his neck, mildly puzzled. He had already been invited, proving himself again felt redundant. Still, the logic behind the request was reinforced. The team needed confidence in their new members before walking into the uncontrolled zone together. That was fair enough. Liu Yi nodded. He understood it. Weijia turned to Blazing Fire and walked him through what he knew about his own ability. He explained that the activation range of his support power was directly tied to the reach of his weapon. To illustrate, he raised his gloved hands and noted that his attack radius was 1 to 2 meters. Anything beyond that range and his abilities simply wouldn't activate. Blazing Fire processed that quickly and said it made sense. The weapon and the ability were directly linked. Liu Yi went quiet on the inside. If Weijia's gloves capped out at 1 to 2 meters and Liu Yi himself used a pistol, what was his actual range? He had never needed to think about it before. His abilities had always fired without him calculating distance. He had completely overlooked this variable. That realization sat uncomfortably. While he was turning it over, Weijia moved into the demonstration. First, he activated his recovery ability, then the second technique, Mantra. He explained it was designed for boss encounters, applying weakening, aging, and slowing effects simultaneously. Third, he demonstrated silence, temporarily binding the New Order's president's hands in place. He clarified that this technique could restrain any enemy, including bosses. His fourth ability, he said, was staying in reserve, a trump card for situations that actually required it. Blazing Fire watched the whole display with quiet satisfaction. Liu Yi filed it away and made his own decision. He would show 3 skills. The fourth was staying hidden. When his turn came, he stepped forward and explained that his weapon gave him an attack radius of 3 meters, wider than Weijia's. He ran through the same opening recovery ability first, then his second technique, Blessing. For the third, he demonstrated Prison. He applied it directly to the president, who was completely locked in place for the duration. He deactivated it cleanly and explained, the effect lasted approximately 10 seconds, though he couldn't confirm it would work reliably against bosses. He also noted that Blessing had the ability to remove negative conditions, including the prison effect itself if needed. Just like Ouija, the fourth ability stayed exactly where it was, his secret. At the end of the demonstration, Liu Yi and Ouija exchanged a look. He caught the quiet confidence behind Ouija's eyes and filed it away. Blazing Fire took in everything he had just seen, then stated plainly that he understood both of their capabilities. With that settled, he announced they could finally move out. He turned to address the rest of the team and explained the situation directly. Due to the absence of support players, the group had always been confined to the outer edges of the uncontrolled zone. But now, with two holders of support power on the roster, they could push deeper into the region and uncover what was actually waiting inside. The team received that news with genuine enthusiasm, fists raised, energy high, before setting off. Liu Yi watched them and let his thoughts drift. The rewards from the Chaos Zone and the Uncontrolled Zone were roughly comparable on paper, but the danger levels were entirely different, so what made the Uncontrolled Zone worth it? Why was the New Order's president so insistent on going there specifically? And if there was something hidden in that place, his train of thought snapped when he realized he had stopped walking entirely. Ouija noticed, he turned back and waved to get his attention. Liu Yi picked up his pace again, offering a smile before falling back in line with the group. But as he walked, his expression gradually settled into something harder. He had already worked it out, there was only room for one support player on this team. Ouija's removal was a matter of time, and when that happened, Liu Yi would be the only one holding that power. The only question was when. When they reached the entrance to the uncontrolled zone, the landscape that greeted them was bleak. Tall, crumbling buildings stretched in every direction, the whole area draped in decay and a suffocating sense of dread. The team captain stepped up and broke down what made this zone fundamentally different from the chaos and danger zones. Here, the difficulty scaled directly with the number of players present. Their group of 10 was the minimum required, and even at that minimum, the effective difficulty would match a squad of 80 combatants. Because of that, constant alertness was non-negotiable. Reckless moves could get everyone killed. He also made one thing clear: killing monsters in this region yielded no rewards. If they encountered any, the priority was shelter. If no shelter was available, distraction. And if members had to be sacrificed to keep the rest alive, that was an acceptable cost. No one responded to that last part immediately. A heavy silence settled over the group. Without another word, the captain dropped off the edge of one of the buildings. The others followed without hesitation, leaping after him one by one. Liu Yi stayed crouched for a moment, taking one last read of the surroundings, then he pushed off and jumped. As he descended, he noticed the darkness thickening around him. The moment his feet touched the ground, he looked up. A flash of lightning carved through the sky between the ruins. He glanced to his side and spotted the rest of the team nearby, and on a half-destroyed building above them, something crouched. A monster. It locked onto the players and let out a deafening roar. Liu Yi's expression tightened as he assessed the threat. Blazing Fire kept his composure and immediately ordered anyone with camouflage skills to activate them. The players moved fast, splitting off in different directions to find cover. The moment they started running, the monster dropped from the rooftop and gave chase. Then, out of nowhere, a second creature appeared and grabbed the first one with brutal force. The captured monster let out a piercing shriek as it was crushed in the larger predator's grip, then hurled off the building entirely. The new threat wasted no time. It turned and came straight after the group. One of the players heard something gaining on them and instinctively looked back. His eyes went wide. A colossal creature was closing in fast. He recognized it immediately and shouted a warning to the guild president. A man-eating leopard was hunting them. What was supposed to be a straightforward entry into the uncontrolled zone had turned into a disaster before they had even gotten started. Blazing Fire kept his head and ordered them not to panic. The priority was still to avoid direct confrontation at all costs. The group ducked into a narrow alley, trying to lose the creature in the turns. Ouija, genuinely curious rather than frightened, asked how strong the leopard actually was. One of the guild members filled him in. On a previous expedition, 10 squads had been sent into the uncontrolled zone to gather intelligence. 5 of those groups were completely wiped out by a single beast of this species. Even with that report sitting in front of him, Ouija looked skeptical. The creature, meanwhile, seemed to have anticipated their escape route. Rather than following them through the alley, it took a shortcut straight through a building wall and materialized directly in their path at the end of the passage. Blazing Fire didn't hesitate. He called out to the blindfolded team member and ordered him to draw the monster's attention. The player stopped immediately and complied. He activated his taunt ability. The effect would hold for 1 minute, cutting the leopard's speed by 10%, though in exchange it would amp the creature's attack power. The moment the ability landed, the monster stopped its charge and shifted its full focus onto the new target. The player turned and ran in the opposite direction from the group, pulling the beast along with him. Weija tracked the whole sequence carefully, calculating, then his gaze slid over to Liu Yi and his expression sharpened. Without a word, he raised his hand and activated his marking ability, placing it directly on Liu Yi. From that moment on, every creature within a 1,000-meter radius would be able to perceive him. The effect would last exactly 10 minutes. The instant the skill activated, every monster in the area turned its attention toward Liu Yi simultaneously. The man-eating leopard, still being led away by the blindfolded player, suddenly stopped cold. The player cursed in confusion, demanding to know why the thing had stopped following him. Liu Yi, meanwhile, was still running, completely unaware that anything had changed. Then a monster launched itself at him from the side. He had no time to set himself. He tried to grab it, but the force of the impact broke his footing. The beast threw him hard into a wall. The impact was brutal. The other players heard the crash and looked back. What they saw made them shout in alarm. Monsters were converging on Liu Yi from every direction at once. Nobody could explain it. 1 second everything was fine, and the next every creature in the area had locked onto the same target. Then Liu Yi's eyes swept across the chaos and found Weija. The smirk on his face said everything. Liu Yi understood immediately. He had been marked. Blazing fire broke into a sprint toward Liu Yi without hesitation. He shouted at the others to fall back to the original shelter and said he would handle the rescue himself. His teammates called after him, thrown off by the decision. Weija watched blazing fire run and quietly concluded the man had lost his mind. There was no coming back from that. He turned to the others and said plainly that blazing fire was making an emotional choice. Liu Yi had become a liability, and that was that. One of the players started to object, but the sound of crumbling structures nearby cut him off. The man-eating leopard had shaken off the taunt. It was back. With no real alternative, the rest of the group turned and headed for the shelter. Blazing fire kept running toward Liu Yi, tracking his health bar the whole time. He ordered him out loud through the channel not to even think about dying there. Then a monster lunged from the side. Blazing fire caught it in his peripheral vision and drew his sword mid-stride. He drove an agile slash toward the creature's chest. The blade didn't leave a mark. He stared at the beast. The defense on these things was on a completely different level than anything he had prepared for. The creature swung its claws back at him. He gritted his teeth, caught the blow, and was shoved back hard. He retreated, watching the swarm of monsters piling onto Liu Yi. The sheer number of them made the situation look unwinnable. For a moment, he genuinely wasn't sure Liu Yi could be reached in time. Then something among the writhing mass of bodies caught his eye. Liu Yi was still moving, still fighting back. The monsters had his arms and legs pinned, but he wasn't done. Liu Yi activated his freeze ability on himself. The system confirmed cognition consumption was suspended. His health had dropped to 5,036 out of 8,040, and he had exactly 10 seconds before the freeze status expired. 10 seconds, that was all he had. Without hesitating, Liu Yi triggered the blessing skill. He burned every knowledge power point he had and pushed all attributes up by 1,406. Several stats broke past 1,000, some climbing above 6,000. The blessing spread through him like a shockwave, dissolving the mark's effect entirely. He tightened his grip on the katana. The system registered it. Energy surged to 2,712 points. Attack power increased by 50%. He swung the blade in a single fluid arc. Every monster within reach was cut down simultaneously. Then the man-eating leopard arrived. It blew through blazing fire's position like he wasn't there, tearing through walls on its way. Liu Yi spotted it closing in with just enough time. He caught the creature's claw at the last second and held on. His feet scraped across the ground as the force pushed him back, but he didn't let go. He made a split-second decision and swapped the katana for the pendulum pistol. He activated the stun effect and leveled the barrel directly at the leopard's head. The instant the creature tensed a strike, he fired direct hit. He immediately switched to his conventional pistol and opened up shot after shot, each round hammering into the leopard's body, until finally, the beast buckled. With a thunderous crash, the man-eating leopard hit the ground and went still. Liu Yi stepped up onto the creature's body, straightened up, and looked around. Beneath his feet, the leopard's corpse began to dissolve. Blazing fire hadn't moved. He stood there staring, voice barely steady, muttering that Liu Yi was a liar, because there was no way a support player was supposed to be able to do that. The system notified Liu Yi 50 seconds remaining before the blessing's effect expired. He was already moving, closing the distance toward blazing fire, who was still trying to process what he had just watched. Liu Yi didn't slow down. He told him they needed to move. Now, then he kept running. Blazing fire snapped out of it as a pack of monsters appeared ahead of them and broke into a sprint to keep up. He shouted for Liu Yi to wait up. Back at the shelter, the rest of the team had barricaded themselves at the dungeon entrance, holding their position. One of the members admitted he had no idea what was happening with the president. He hadn't sent a single message and the guy was almost too nervous to check for a reply. Another said he was thinking the same thing. Weija looked puzzled and asked why they didn't just retreat. What player could realistically survive out there under those conditions? One of the men replied that both the president and Liu Yi were still showing active health bars. If their HP hadn't flatlined, it was because they were running skills that were absorbing or blocking damage temporarily. But Liu Yi's situation specifically was strange. For some reason he had drawn an overwhelming concentration of monsters, the kind you simply couldn't outrun. Nobody could explain exactly what had triggered it, but whatever had happened, it had turned the entire area against him. That was a serious problem. Man crossed his arms and gritted his teeth, saying nothing more. Then one of their teammates suddenly called out. Both of them had appeared on the map and they weren't far from the shelter. Weiji's eyes narrowed. Everyone else erupted. One of the more experienced players immediately warned the group that the two might be dragging monsters behind them. He ordered everyone into defensive positions around the entrance. The team locked in at the doorway, weapons ready. One player noted it was quiet, no sounds of anything approaching. Short while later, Blazing Fire stepped into the shelter with Liu Yi beside him. The team's relief came out loud and immediate. Weija was the only exception. He watched them return with a flat, calculated expression. In his head, the guild president was now the bigger problem. The players crowded around Blazing Fire, praising him, said it was incredible that he had navigated that situation and still pulled Liu Yi out of it. A title like his was clearly earned. Blazing Fire said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Liu Yi's back and whatever was behind them had nothing to do with pride. The two of them peeled away from the group and moved to the back of the shelter, sitting down on a pair of concrete blocks. That was when Blazing Fire finally spoke. He said the compliments could stop. What they needed to do was recover and then push to the dungeon. The team agreed, the energy in the group picking back up. Meanwhile, Weija had his eyes on Liu Yi, who sat quietly, expression unreadable. Weija walked over and sat beside him with a smile. He asked how Liu Yi had managed to get out of that mess. Must have been quite the ride. Liu Yi glanced at him briefly and something from earlier surfaced in his memory. The moment the system had dissolved the mark skill, he replied without hesitation. He told Weija that he already knew the answer because he was the one who had done it. Weija went rigid. He forced a casual wave and asked what Liu Yi was even talking about. Liu Yi held his gaze and said he found it interesting that Weija didn't know. He explained clearly blessing was a skill capable of removing any negative effect, including the mark that had been placed on him. Weiji's eyes widened slightly. Liu Yi continued. The mark was a level 40 skill. In this group, only 2 people were capable of using it. A silence settled between them. Liu Yi drew his gun. His expression was cold and direct as he said that from the moment he joined this team, he had considered ending Weija right then and there. But after watching him, something had changed his read. Weiji's hesitation hadn't come from fear, it had come from a kind of stubborn resolve. He rose slowly and pointed the weapon directly at Weija. He said plainly that there was only one way to resolve this. Weija didn't move, didn't speak. Then he broke, shouting that this was insane. They were partners, not enemies. The rest of the team snapped to attention, watching the standoff without fully understanding what had sparked it. Weija wore a cynical smile through it all. He found something almost cinematic about being threatened at gunpoint, but in his mind it only confirmed what he had known since the start. Liu Yi needed to be cut from the team. And if the mark ability was level 40 and only 2 people could have used it, then Liu Yi had already narrowed it down to him. The accusation was going to stick regardless. One of the players yelled at Liu Yi, demanding to know what he was doing. Blazing Fire stayed seated. He didn't intervene. Liu Yi watched Weija with a slight, patient smile. Weija kept pushing his case. He had simply asked how Liu Yi escaped and suddenly there was a gun in his face. He spread his hands like the whole thing was absurd. He turned to the president and asked directly whether this was something the team was actually going to allow. Blazing Fire said nothing. Weija pressed harder, pivoting his argument. Liu Yi was probably doing this because he wanted to be the only support player on the team. If he succeeded, he would start dictating terms and the president would have no choice but to accept them just to get through the dungeon. That couldn't be allowed to stand. He looked around at the others and demanded they pay attention. Liu Yi was dead weight. He had attracted an army of monsters and nearly gotten everyone killed. He had no business staying on this team. Liu Yi remained exactly as he was, calm, because to him the situation was already resolved. Weija had orchestrated all of it. Weija turned back to the president and insisted Liu Yi needed to go. One of the team members tried to step in and suggested they table the argument until they were somewhere safer. Blazing Fire stood up. He placed a hand on the player's shoulder and stopped him. His posture made it clear this was getting settled here right now. Weija felt the ground shift under him. To him, Blazing Fire was making a serious mistake. Then the president stepped forward and grabbed Liu Yi's gun, firmly removing it from his grip. He turned that same stare onto Ouija and demanded an explanation. Ouija hesitated, caught between confusion and a growing unease. Then he felt pressure close around his throat. Blazing Fire had grabbed him hard. The question that followed came out sharp and low, asking why he kept working to fracture the team from the inside. The grip made breathing difficult. Ouija struggled against it, gasping, demanding to know what was going on. Blazing Fire didn't release his throat. He stated flatly that he trusted Liu Yi far more than Ouija could possibly understand. Ouija couldn't process it. He argued that Liu Yi had been the one to draw the gun first, but the excuse went nowhere. The president activated his ability. His voice was steady and final as he declared that Liu Yi would never have done that without a reason. Ouija stared at him in disbelief. The president was willing to take Liu Yi's side over his without a single piece of evidence. He genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. But before another word could leave his mouth, the Shadow Blood Shell ability activated. A viscous, dark red liquid poured over him, sealing him completely inside a bloody shell. His body locked. His health began to drain. He tried to trigger a recovery skill and realized with a sinking dread that he couldn't. Everything was blocked. As the health bar continued to fall, panic set in. Staggering, he lurched toward Liu Yi in a final act of desperation and grabbed him by the throat. His eyes were wide with terror, his breathing ragged and shallow. Then his body stopped moving. The last breath left him. He dropped to his knees, health at 0. In an instant, he was gone. The bloody shell collapsed, splashed across the ground, and returned to Blazing Fire. Liu Yi had watched the whole thing in silence. He finally broke it, addressing Blazing Fire directly. Then he sat down and quietly said thank you. A faint smile. His mind drifted back to those moments surrounded by monsters, completely alone, nowhere to go. A disturbing realization followed. If Blazing Fire hadn't stepped in, Liu Yi might have had no choice but to eliminate everyone on the team himself. After a few moments, Blazing Fire turned to face him. With a measured look, he made a proposal Liu Yi hadn't expected. He wanted Liu Yi to join the new order, then he added the terms. Within the guild, Liu Yi would be given the highest available rank. Blazing Fire acknowledged that there was bad history between Liu Yi and the new order and apologized for Ouija's death. He said plainly that recruiting someone of Liu Yi's caliber was worth working through those complications. The guild members exchanged glances. Their president had never shown this kind of deliberateness when recruiting someone, and the conditions being offered were extraordinary, nothing like what any of them had received. One of the players pointed out that every other member had gone through multiple evaluation stages to earn their spot. He couldn't figure out what made Liu Yi worth skipping all of that. Liu Yi responded with a question nobody had anticipated. He asked what the price was. Blazing Fire looked momentarily caught off guard. Before he could answer, another player jumped in and called the question absurd. He should be asking about the benefits first, not the costs. Liu Yi explained his reasoning calmly. When joining a guild, the benefits were secondary. The most important thing to understand first was what you were agreeing to give up. Blazing Fire held his gaze. Then he lowered his head slightly and smiled. He told Liu Yi there was no price. Liu Yi didn't believe him for a second. He knew that when the moment came to pay, the cost would almost certainly be something he wasn't willing to hand over. The real price, the unspoken one, was the readiness to sacrifice everything when the guild demanded it. Levels, valuable equipment, all of it. The compensation would be generous, but the ask was total. Liu Yi looked at him with quiet suspicion. In his view, going deeper into the uncontrolled zone dungeon with this guild was almost guaranteed to end in a massacre. Those words landed visibly. The president and the guild members both stiffened. After a brief pause, Blazing Fire replied carefully that he didn't believe it would come to that. The probability, he claimed, was low. Liu Yi wasn't buying it. He said that plenty of promises had been made in this world with no guarantee behind them. Blazing Fire stayed quiet and watched him. Liu Yi laid out his position. He was willing to form an alliance, but he would not give up his equipment or his levels under any circumstances, and after this dungeon he would not be running content with anyone else. The guild members took that as an insult. To them, Liu Yi had no idea what he was turning down. Guild members pulled annual earnings exceeding 2 million. The only trade-off was surrendering your in-game equipment when the guild needed it. In their eyes, he was either naive or completely out of his mind. Blazing Fire, however, just sat back on the concrete block and took a slow breath. He admitted quietly that losing a player of this caliber was a shame, but he also understood that not everything revolved around the new order. An alliance was still a workable arrangement. Liu Yi smiled and thanked him for understanding. As he looked at Blazing Fire's composed expression, his thoughts reached back into his past life. If he hadn't lived through the weight of that first life, hadn't felt firsthand what it meant to lose your gear and your levels at the worst possible moment, he might have made a different call just now. And yet here he was at a strength level where the president of the New Order was personally extending an invitation. For most players, that would be a once-in-a-lifetime moment. He looked down, sitting with the weight of it. For just a moment, a small flicker of regret moved through him. He pushed it aside. With a quiet smile, he reminded himself there was nothing to apologize for. Blazing Fire wanted him because of his strength, full stop. Sentiment had nothing to do with it. And if he kept growing stronger and stayed alive, more people would come looking for him. That was simply how this world worked. Meanwhile, Blazing Fire stared at the guild chat window, his expression tight. A player named Bei Shou had posted a message wishing everyone luck. He wrote that the first uncontrolled zone dungeon would be different from anything they had run before. It would contain 10% of the membrane's computing power. A few lines later, he added that one of the conditions for a perfect clear of a special dungeon was triggering a desperate situation. He had failed his last attempt completely. Not only did the dungeon go uncleared, every one of his allies died. He had no idea how long it would take to put a new team together. Reading that, Blazing Fire's jaw tightened. He turned the implications over in his head. If a desperate situation was genuinely one of the conditions for clearing it, everything just got significantly more complicated. His gaze drifted to Liu Yi. He had already failed the first move. Trying to bring him in through incentives hadn't worked, but Liu Yi's strength was still an asset he couldn't afford to ignore. He had to keep finding a way forward. In the chat, Zeno noted that a team appeared to be on the move, heading into an uncontrolled zone to locate the computing power membrane. Bei Shou responded that 50% of that power was currently accessible, and that they would soon see how much each group could secure for themselves. Chino mentioned that both the Chaos Zone and Danger Zone also held 10% of the computing power each, but in his view the investment wasn't worth it. Another player backed that up. The cost-benefit ratio was simply better in the uncontrolled zone, where a single run could yield 10% at once. In the other zones, you were grinding 1% per attempt at the same difficulty. Juanshu suggested routing players who could realistically manage the situation. All of that made Blazing Fire reconsider his options. Perhaps the better move was to bring in a player who understood team dynamics, someone like Strikes. If a massacre did occur inside the dungeon and Liu Yi refused to work with the group, Strikes could be used to take him out. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. They moved out again shortly after. As they walked, Liu Yi reflected on the value of his temporary arrangement with the New Order. By running alongside this guild, he was getting a direct look at their full operational strength. And in the meantime, the assault on the uncontrolled zone's dungeons was underway. The team composition was solid. A main tank known as Fresh Meat Fan, a support tank in the form of the guild president himself, a support fighter who never removed his blindfold, and a damage dealer who worked with twin swords and lethal efficiency. Rounding out the group was a damage-gathering specialist who eliminated monsters quietly and without drawing attention, one of the most underrated roles on any serious team. With that coordination, the group cleared a level 50 dungeon in under 4 hours. As they pressed further into the uncontrolled zone, the completions stacked up. By the 4th day, they had cleared 12 dungeons. That was when Liu Yi hit level 50. It felt significant not just for the number, but because reaching level 50 unlocked a special rebirth power ability. 2 options appeared before him. The first was Cooldown Reset, an active skill that instantly refreshed every other ability but carried a 12-hour recharge time. The second was Scan, which mapped everything within a 1,000-meter radius, identifying resources, creatures, and nearby players. It consumed 100 cognition points per hour at a rate of 10 points per second, had no cooldown, and expanded its radius by 100 meters for every 10 levels gained. By the 3rd day in the uncontrolled zone, Liu Yi had already reached level 50. On day 6, the team finally found what Blazing Fire had been hunting for. The moment the portal to the special dungeon appeared, Blazing Fire's composure cracked just enough to let through a rare expression of genuine excitement. Shortly after, a replacement player was brought in to fill the slot Ouija had vacated, a second-tier guild member serving as a temporary stand-in until a proper replacement could be arranged. Meanwhile, Strikes was cutting through the narrow corridors between ruined buildings at a hard sprint. He planted his feet and launched himself upward with a sharp burst of force, landing cleanly on top of a building where the team had gathered at the dungeon entrance. He stood for a moment and took in the surroundings. Level 56, his presence alone visibly shifted the energy in the group. The moment he touched down, everyone let out a visible breath of relief. Strikes grinned, gave a thumbs up, and immediately followed it with a complaint. He had told those brainless chickens not to push forward without him. The smiles around him disappeared instantly. a beat of silence. Then someone fired back that the same rule applied to him. Strikes laughed, then turned to Blazing Fire and cleared his throat, clearly trying to walk back his entrance. He said he hadn't been given all the details of the situation. Blazing Fire looked at him with the expression of someone who had been managing this personality for far too long. Liu Yi watched the whole exchange and started building a read on the new arrival. He recognized him, Strikes, one of the top 5 players in the meta world before Liu Yi's reincarnation. He had already defeated a mirror copy of Strikes in the mirror realm, but a copy and the real thing were different questions entirely. As Liu Yi was still working through that, Strikes finally shifted his attention toward the team and zeroed in. He moved toward the support player and stopped in front of him. He asked straight up if this was the so-called Liu Yi. The player looked at him and smiled. He mentioned that the guild president had described Liu Yi as someone strong enough to be compared to Strike's little toe. Blazing Fire went rigid. The rest of the team tensed immediately. Liu Yi frowned. If Strikes was comparing him to a toe, then maybe that toe needed to come off. He quietly hoped it wouldn't end up costing someone their life to find out. Blazing Fire stepped in before it escalated and told Strikes directly to stop talking nonsense. Strikes turned to Liu Yi and apologized, said he had a habit of blurting things out without thinking, but that he didn't have a bad temper under it all. Then he glanced back at the guild president and added that if Liu Yi really was as strong as his toe, well, that was a compliment actually. Before he could elaborate on that, Blazing Fire raised a single finger and ordered the others to get him into the dungeon. Several players grabbed Strikes by the arms and dragged him toward the portal, informing him that since he was so powerful he could go in first and prove it. Strikes complained loudly that he wasn't like the rest of them and didn't need to be handled. Blazing Fire watched them disappear through the entrance and had a quiet moment of wondering how exactly this man had ended up in his guild. And then he was alone with Liu Yi facing the dungeon portal. The entrance to the special uncontrolled zone dungeon stood before them, the one Blazing Fire had been working toward since the beginning. He took a slow breath to settle himself. Then he turned to Liu Yi. He told him plainly the new order's true objective in this entire region was this dungeon. Whatever happened during the raid, the guild would owe Liu Yi a debt. That caught Liu Yi off guard, and it only deepened the question he had been sitting with: what exactly was inside that dungeon that made it worth all of this? Blazing Fire turned back to the portal, radiating a quiet, absolute confidence. After a moment, he stepped forward and told Liu Yi to follow. Before going in, Liu Yi let his thoughts run one final loop. In his past life, he had never spoken directly with the president of the new order, not once. Back then, he was too low-level to even register on the guild's radar. Everything he knew had come through rumors, stories that painted the guild leader as ruthless, cold, someone who valued people only as tools. But after spending these days under his leadership, Liu Yi had started to see something more complicated. For a brief moment, he found himself considering the possibility that they could have been friends under different circumstances. He let that thought go quickly. Real friendship only formed between people with aligned interests. What he was feeling now was the temporary satisfaction of functioning well inside a team. Nothing more. At his core, he knew the truth: if a conflict ever put him and the new order on opposite sides, there would be no alliance left, no room for sentiment. The only person he could unconditionally trust was his sister. And if circumstances made the guild an enemy, he would fight with everything he had. With that clarity locked in, he stepped through the portal. The environment changed the instant he crossed over. What unfolded before him wasn't the dungeon, it was a memory recorded into the location itself. 2 figures stood watching something stir inside an incubation chamber with quiet satisfaction. The creature had been born successfully. After removing it from the chamber, the scientists sealed it inside an isolated observation room to monitor its development. One of them, visibly excited, commented on the experiment's success and praised what technology had made possible. The Research Institute's director, pleased with the progress, asked for a status update on the brainwashing procedures applied to the creature. The response was discouraging. Every method tested so far had only made it more agitated. Then, without warning, the creature began to move faster than anything in the room was prepared for. Before the scientist could react, the monster shattered the containment glass and launched itself at the director. In the scattered shards on the floor, its reflection revealed something terrifying. Amid the chaos, one of the scientists, gravely injured, barely able to move, crawled toward a table. With the last strength he had, he managed to warn the others to prevent the creature from escaping. The director, overwhelmed, made a desperate call. He shot to his feet and shouted with full urgency that they had to destroy it. Then he slammed a large red button. The cutscene ended and the world snapped back into focus. Liu Yi and the rest of the team were standing on a mountaintop facing the entrance to the research institute. The group held still for a moment, reading the area around them. Liu Yi recognized the structure immediately, another special dungeon built around embedded cutscenes. He had seen this format before. Blazing Fire pulled up the mission information the system had generated. The interface confirmed it: dungeon mission active, teleportation disabled, mission title and experiment gone wrong. Objective: transport the Screaming Serpent's life source to Membrane 304, located in the core of the Research Institute for Ancient Organism Incubation. The mission came with strict conditions. The life source could not be moved to storage, it had to remain in the player's active inventory at all times. Their lives were directly tied to the item. If the bottle broke, the player holding it died instantly. Seconds later, a bottle materialized in each player's hands. Blazing Fire assessed the situation quickly and confirmed that every player had received a life source. For a perfect run, ideally no one could afford to die. He took a breath, then signaled the team forward. Liu Yi gripped the bottle carefully and examined it. Up to this point, he had only encountered 2 dungeons with integrated cutscenes, one of them being the mission he had run with Wei Zai. As the group began to move, nobody noticed the shadows shifting above them. High overhead, something tracked their every step in complete silence. Then the calm shattered, a deafening scream tore across the entire mountainside. A colossal serpent materialized from above, its cry resonating through the stone itself. The group spun around instantly, and the chill that ran through the team was visible. Blazing Fire reacted immediately, calling out positions and ordering the players into combat formation. Before anyone could fully set themselves, the serpent screamed a second time, unleashing a powerful sound wave. The impact was immediate and devastating. Several players went to their knees, bottles slipping from their grip, hands pressed to their ears in agony. The moment the glass hit the ground and shattered, the players who had dropped them began to dissolve. The system's announcement followed without delay. 3 team members had died. Blazing Fire stared at the shattered glass scattered across the ground, his expression hardening. 3 life sources gone before the dungeon had even properly begun. A condition notification appeared before Liu Yi, updating him on the new state of things. He turned his attention back to the serpent and noticed Strikes was already charging toward it. The man had apparently decided he was going to handle this personally and wasn't slowing down for anyone. The team watched with a mixture of alarm and resignation. After losing 3 people, nobody wanted to watch another member go down. Strikes showed absolutely zero hesitation. He launched himself at the monster with everything he had, intent written across every movement. He was going to avenge the 3 who had just died. The strike connected with tremendous force. A blade didn't do a thing to the serpent. Before he could adjust, the creature's massive jaw swung open. In one clean, precise motion, it swallowed him whole. The team stood in stunned silence. Some had half expected it, others were speechless at how fast it had happened. One moment Strikes was charging in, the next he simply wasn't there. With no further interest in the remaining players, the serpent turned and slipped back into the forest, disappearing. Then Blazing Fire noticed something. The liquid from the bottles carried by the dead players had redistributed, seeping into the remaining flasks. He processed it immediately. A perfect clear didn't require every player to survive. It required all 10 parts of the life source to be delivered to the destination. The bottles and the players were separate concerns. Meanwhile, some of the players were still debating whether Strikes was actually dead. Someone checked the team list, his name was still active. He was still inside the serpent. That meant rescue wasn't off the table, theoretically, but nobody had the first idea how to fight something their attacks couldn't even scratch. Blazing Fire shut that conversation down quickly. If Strikes had survived this long in there, he still had a fighting chance on his own. The mission came first. Getting to the Research Institute and delivering the life sources was the priority. Liu Yi read the situation carefully. Everything about Blazing Fire's decision-making pointed toward the same conclusion. He was aiming for a perfect clear. The memory of receiving 1% computing power for his own flawless run surfaced in his mind. He was increasingly certain Blazing Fire was after the same reward. With no better option available, the group resumed their advance, moving at pace toward the Institute. 20 minutes later, as the destination came into range, one of the players cross-referenced the team map and went quiet. Strikes was moving, not slowly fast, abnormally fast. At first, the assumption was that he had escaped and was trying to catch up. That assumption didn't last long. The conclusion hit almost simultaneously. It wasn't Strikes moving, it was the creature that had swallowed him. The warning barely left someone's mouth before one of the players caught movement in the undergrowth beside them and alerted the president. Blazing Fire stopped and turned just in time. The screaming serpent surged out of the vegetation directly at him, jaw wide open. He activated Blood Shadow and slipped the attack at the last possible second. The moment he was clear, he read the field and called it. He ordered everyone into combat stances and told Strikes if he was still alive in there to start attacking from the inside. The serpent registered the movement around it and redirected its attention to the group. The team committed and launched a coordinated attack. They hit the creature from multiple angles, landing blows across its body. Nothing registered, not a single point of damage. The creature absorbed every strike without flinching, then its tail swung wide. Several players were thrown off their feet and hit the ground hard. They recovered quickly, burning health skills to get back into the fight. One of the fighters reached out with a whip and cracked it across the creature's face. He triggered his taunt ability and started moving laterally, keeping the serpent's attention on him. Then he broke away from the group and ran in the opposite direction. He blew past the guild president who was watching the serpent and waiting for an opening. The serpent threw its head back and screamed again. Sound waves rolled outward across the entire area. One of the players had no window to react. His bottle shattered on impact. His body began to break apart immediately. The realization hit him before the end did. The rest of the team shouted his name. There was nothing that could be done. Blazing Fire and Liu Yi stood side by side and watched the spot where their teammate had been a second ago. The loss sat heavily on everyone. Then another player, still shaken, relayed what Strikes had reported from inside the serpent. The interior defenses were extraordinary. He couldn't deal any damage from inside the creature at all. Blazing Fire shifted his focus back to the serpent, studying it. Up close, the structure was wrong for a snake. The body construction was closer to an insect, which explained the resistance. Liu Yi understood the core danger immediately. The bottles couldn't be stored and the serpent's sound waves destroyed them on impact. Every scream was a direct threat to every player still standing. There was no way to armor against it. The tension in the group was palpable. The real possibility of losing nearly everyone at the very start of the dungeon hung over all of them. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then the screaming serpent began to move again. It turned, slipped back into the tree line and vanished. The players stared after it, confused. Why would it pull back after eliminating two of them, as they tried to piece together an answer? They noticed the liquid from the broken bottles had redistributed again, absorbed into the flasks still held by surviving players. The fluid inside each bottle was visibly brighter than before. Blazing Fire observed it and began to form a hypothesis. The serpent wasn't attacking randomly, it was conducting its own kind of test, probing the group, applying pressure, observing the results. Liu Yi turned the mission over in his mind. If a perfect clear was really what Blazing Fire was after, what would actually satisfy that condition? Killing the serpent might not be the objective at all. The real goal might be to consolidate all the remaining life sources into one place. Blazing Fire ordered the team to stay focused. With the monster temporarily gone, they had a window to push to the research institute. They moved without wasting another second. 20 minutes later, a massive structure came into view. There was an enormous hole torn through the outer wall. Something had broken out from the inside at some point. One of the players checked the map and reported to the president. A serpent was still in the immediate area. Blazing Fire assessed the numbers and made a decision that surprised everyone. He ordered one of the players to break their own bottle. The chosen player froze. They hadn't expected that. Another player immediately objected. They couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Blazing Fire held firm. With this many players, defeating the creature wasn't possible. Speed was what they needed, not firepower. If they could pull the serpent away from the institute, they'd have the time to get inside and explore. Luring it was the only viable play. Faced with no real alternative, the player gritted his teeth and shattered the bottle. The system confirmed another team member's death. The screaming serpent responded immediately, pivoting and moving away from the institute in the opposite direction. The plan had worked. The players exhaled and pushed forward. One of them called the whole thing a stroke of genius. Another said they owed the captain for giving them a way to track the dungeon boss's movements at will. Blazing Fire checked the map and confirmed his hypothesis was holding. Meanwhile, Liu Yi's mind was already elsewhere. Before this, he had refused to spend money on equipment or levels without a clear reason. Now, if Blazing Fire had actually cracked the formula for a perfect clear, Liu Yi could become a target the moment they stepped inside the institute. In an enclosed space, being surrounded would be easy. Blazing Fire called the team to move faster. The institute entrance was visible ahead. The group crossed the clearing at a run and hit the stairs, taking them quickly toward the entrance. Then Liu Yi stopped. A thought had crystallized. He couldn't let them box him in inside that building. The other players noticed his hesitation. They stopped at the top of the stairs and asked what was wrong, watching him. Liu Yi looked directly at Blazing Fire and asked one question. What was the simplest way to complete this mission? The group went quiet. The implication was clear enough. He was bracing for a fight. Blazing Fire frowned and walked to the edge of the steps. He said plainly that Liu Yi had it wrong. The dungeon's difficulty was too high for any kind of internal conflict to make sense, and he had no intention of moving against him. His only goal was clearing the mission. If Liu Yi didn't trust him, he could stay outside while the three of them finished the job. The threat from the serpent out here was arguably worse than whatever waited inside the institute, but the offer stood. Liu Yi said nothing, he waited. One of the players called out to him in frustration. Why was he distrusting the president? It was embarrassing. Another backed it up, pointing out that they had been working together for days without incident. Was Liu Yi seriously expecting Blazing Fire to treat him like family after a few days? Did he think that was realistic? Liu Yi's expression tightened as he ran the numbers. He pulled up the map discreetly. By his calculations, strikes would arrive in roughly 10 minutes. The serpent attacked on roughly a 20-minute cycle, which meant the next strike was 13 minutes out. If he was going to act, it had to happen before Blazing Fire was reunited with strikes. Blazing Fire turned back toward the entrance, smiled calm and unbothered, and said no one was being forced into anything. They just needed to complete the mission. He walked inside. The remaining players, annoyed and done with the delay, insulted Liu Yi on the way past, calling him a traitor, saying they couldn't rely on him when it mattered. They were going in without him. Liu Yi gripped the katana and ran the combat math. Freeze status, 10 seconds. Blessing, 60 seconds active. Current opponents including strikes, 4 players with substantial combat power. If he staggered the freeze and the blessing correctly, there was a path through this. If he made an error, the New Order alliance was finished. If he hesitated, everything he had built toward would be wasted. Blazing Fire paused and looked back, noticing the indecision. The guild members cut in with contempt. Did he actually intend to attack them? Fine, the alliance was dead, but they weren't going to lower themselves to killing him. That wasn't worth their time. The answer became clear. Liu Yi activated the freeze status and the blessing simultaneously. Every attribute surged. He launched toward Blazing Fire, who triggered his own skills in the same instant. Blazing Fire's body vanished. One of the players shouted in disbelief. Liu Yi was throwing everything away and he wasn't going to last. Before they could finish the sentence, Liu Yi's katana was already moving and cut one of the players cleanly in half. The player hit the ground. Before disappearing, he managed one disbelieving murmur that it wasn't possible. The system registered a team member's death. The second player charged in, weaving to throw off Liu Yi's read. Liu Yi tracked the pattern and waited for the window to open. He adjusted his grip, stepped in and delivered a precise committed strike. The system confirmed another death. Liu Yi checked the map. Blazing Fire hadn't moved from his last position. Strikes, on the other hand, was closing in fast. He put everything he had left into the next attack, driving it with full force, and took out a section of the building wall entirely. Debris rained in every direction. He checked Blazing Fire's health bar the moment the dust cleared. Full. Despite the impact, he hadn't landed a single point of damage. Blazing Fire's invisibility skill had eaten the entire attack. He pulled up the map again. Blazing Fire was still showing in the same spot, but there was no physical trace of him anywhere in the rubble. What kind of skill was this? And Strikes was almost on top of them. The system notified him freeze status had expired. Liu Yi faced the debris and raised his voice, calling out to Blazing Fire directly. He asked whether the man was just going to hide and refuse to face him. Blazing Fire didn't respond, didn't reveal himself. Then the system notified him that the blessing had also run out. Liu Yi muttered to himself, if Blazing Fire wanted to make hiding his whole strategy, fine. He could stay invisible as long as he wanted, but Strikes had already arrived. Seconds later, his figure emerged into the clearing. Liu Yi registered the movement on the map. Blazing Fire had started moving toward his ally. He stepped out of his invisible state, smile sharp and deliberate. He looked at Liu Yi and offered a compliment on the audacity, genuinely impressive. Then he pointed out the problem. During the encounter with the man-eating leopard, Liu Yi had been forced to show everything he had. Blazing Fire said flatly that in the end, all it had cost him was 2 men. Liu Yi didn't answer, he just frowned. Strikes drew his sword. Without a word exchanged between them, he and Blazing Fire moved in together. And that's where we leave it for today. What a ride this story has been. If you're as hooked as I am, make sure you don't miss the next part. Hit subscribe and drop a like so the algorithm knows you want more. Until next time, take care and I'll catch you in the next one.